What could connect the windswept valleys of Central Asia, the ruins left by Timur's armies, the Persian-speaking courts of Iran and India, the battlefields of Panipat, and a white marble tomb beside the Yamuna River that would become one of the most recognizable buildings on Earth? The answer is a dynasty that did not begin in India, but would become inseparable from Indian history. For more than 3 centuries, from Babur's victory at Panipat in 1526 until the formal deposition of Bahadur Shah Zafar in 1857, the Mughal dynasty occupied a place at the center of South Asian politics. But those 3 centuries were never one continuous age of unquestioned power. The empire was created by conquest, nearly destroyed within a generation, rebuilt by an exiled emperor, transformed by a teenage sovereign, expanded by rulers who experimented with radically different ideas of kingship, and eventually stretched so far that maintaining its victories became almost as dangerous as losing them. At its height, the Mughal state governed most of the Indian subcontinent and commanded enormous agricultural revenues. Its emperors dealt with Persian shahs, Uzbek rulers, Ottoman connections, Rajput kings, Deccan sultans, Sikh gurus, Maratha leaders, Jesuit missionaries, and European merchants who initially appeared far less important than the great Asian powers surrounding India. Its workshops produced paintings of extraordinary detail. Its administrators measured fields and calculated revenue. Its armies combined cavalry traditions inherited from Central Asia with gunpowder weapons that were changing warfare across Eurasia. Its courts helped make Persian one of the great languages of government and literary culture in South Asia, while the interaction of Persianate traditions with Indian languages contributed over centuries to the development of the literary culture associated with Urdu. Its rulers built forts, mosques, gardens, palaces, tombs, and entire cities. Yet the Mughal story cannot be reduced to artistic splendor, nor can it be reduced to a simple story of foreign conquerors imposing themselves on a passive country. The empire was built inside the political world of South Asia, through alliances as well as wars, through negotiations with existing elites as well as attempts to overpower them. Rajputs became some of the empire's most important commanders. Indian revenue specialists helped construct its fiscal system. Persian immigrants competed with Central Asian nobles, Indian Muslims, Rajputs, Marathas, and other groups for imperial rank. Different emperors made different choices about religion, political inclusion, taxation, warfare, and culture. Those choices mattered. But so did geography, climate, military technology, succession disputes, regional interests, harvests, trade, and the simple difficulty of ruling millions of people across an enormous territory before railways, telegraphs, or modern communications existed. And long before any Mughal emperor sat in Delhi, the first threads of this story had already been drawn together hundreds of kilometers to the northwest. The dynasty's founder was Zahir al-Din Muhammad Babur. To understand why Babur came to India, however, it is necessary to understand why he could no longer remain in the world he considered his ancestral home. That story begins with Timur. Timur was born in 1336 near Kesh, south of Samarkand, in what is today Uzbekistan. He belonged to the Barlas, a Turkicized Mongol group, and he rose in a Central Asian political environment still shaped by the enormous prestige of Chinggis Khan. Timur was not a direct male line descendant of Chinggis Khan. That distinction mattered because Chinggisid ancestry carried enormous political legitimacy on the steppe. Timur therefore ruled through a political framework that respected Chinggisid tradition, while strengthening his own legitimacy through marriage into a Chinggisid family. This helped produce the title by which he was sometimes known Gurkhan, or son-in-law. But whatever complexities surrounded his claim to legitimacy, there was little ambiguity about his military power. During the second half of the 14th century, Timur built an empire extending across much of Central Asia, Iran, Mesopotamia, and neighboring regions. His campaigns could be extraordinarily destructive. Cities that resisted him might face massacre and devastation, while skilled artisans and scholars could be transported to imperial centers. Samarkand benefited from the wealth and talent drawn into Timur's realm. Others experienced Timurid expansion as catastrophe. India encountered that catastrophe directly in 1398. Timur crossed the Indus and advanced toward Delhi, then ruled by the weakened Tughlaq dynasty. His army defeated the forces defending the capital. Delhi was subsequently subjected to terrible violence and plunder. Timur did not remain to establish a lasting Indian government. He returned toward Central Asia, carrying immense wealth and captives. When he died in 1405, his empire did not remain united as a single political structure. But Timurid power survived in successor states, and something important happened in those states. The descendants of a conqueror remembered for devastating campaigns also became patrons of an extraordinarily sophisticated Persianate culture. Cities such as Samarkand and Herat became centers of architecture, miniature painting, poetry, scholarship, astronomy, and courtly life. Persian culture flourished beside Turkic traditions. The Timurid prince could be expected to fight, govern, appreciate poetry, construct gardens, understand genealogy, and imagine himself as heir to an illustrious imperial tradition. This was the complicated inheritance Babur received. He was born in 1483 in Andijan in the Fergana Valley. Through his father, Umar Sheikh Mirza II, Babur descended from Timur. Through his mother, Kutluf Nigar Khanum, he was connected to the Chagatai, Chinggisid line. Later generations would therefore remember Babur as a man standing at the intersection of two formidable Central Asian genealogies. But ancestry could not give a boy an army when his enemies were approaching, and Babur learned that lesson almost immediately. In 1494, when he was 11 years old, his father died unexpectedly after a fall from a dovecot built along a ravine. The young Babur inherited Fergana. He inherited its enemies as well. Relatives maneuvered against him. Nobles reconsidered their loyalties. Neighboring rulers watched for weakness. And above everything else in Babur's imagination stood Samarkand. Samarkand was not simply another wealthy city. It was Timur's capital. For a Timurid prince, possessing Samarkand carried a significance that was political, historical, and personal. Babur pursued it with remarkable persistence. In 1497, while still a teenager, he captured the city after a difficult siege. It should have been the beginning of his rise. Instead, it nearly destroyed him. While Babur struggled to secure Samarkand, rebellion threatened Fergana. His forces weakened. He became ill. Before long, he had lost Samarkand. Then he lost Fergana. The descendant of Timur, still barely more than a boy, had managed to win the city he dreamed of and lose almost everything else while doing it. He would try again. And again. Central Asian politics, however, were changing around him. A powerful Uzbek leader, Muhammad Shaybani Khan, was building a new political order in Transoxiana. The Uzbeks steadily displaced Timurid princes from territories they had once treated as their inheritance. Babur briefly recovered Samarkand in 1500, only to lose it to Shaybani Khan. Years later, after Shaybani's death and with Safavid assistance, Babur captured Samarkand yet again in 1511. Once more, he could not hold it. By then, a pattern had become unmistakable. Babur possessed courage, dynastic ambition, and considerable military ability. What he did not possess was a realistic path to permanent restoration in Transoxiana. Long before finally abandoning that dream, however, he had found another base. 1504, Babur captured Kabul. That victory changed his life. Kabul and its surrounding regions could not replace Samarkand emotionally, but politically, they gave Babur something desperately important. They gave him a kingdom. From Kabul, Babur could stabilize his position, reward followers, acquire new resources, and look in several directions for expansion. To the north lay the Central Asian lands he continued to covet. To the southeast, beyond mountain passes and the Indus, lay the wealthy and politically divided plains of northern India. Babur knew something of India from Timurid memory and from his own expeditions toward the frontier. But India was not empty land waiting for a conqueror. At the beginning of the 16th century, the subcontinent contained numerous states and political traditions. The Lodi dynasty of Afghan origin controlled Delhi and substantial parts of northern India. Bengal and Gujarat were powerful sultanates. Mewar was a major Rajput kingdom. Malwa remained strategically important. In the Deccan, successor states to the Bahmani Sultanate competed with one another and with the great southern kingdom of Vijayanagara. There was wealth, military power, and intense political rivalry. At Delhi, Sultan Ibrahim Lodi faced a particularly dangerous problem. Some of his own Afghan nobles resented his attempts to assert stronger royal authority. Among those who came into conflict with him were Dulat Khan Lodi in Punjab and Alam Khan, an uncle of Ibrahim. Invitations and negotiations involving Babur followed. The exact expectations of the Indian nobles and Babur were not necessarily identical. Those who encouraged him may have imagined that the Central Asian ruler could help rearrange the balance of power. Babur increasingly imagined something far greater. He had already made several expeditions into regions west of the Indus and Punjab. Now he prepared to turn intervention into conquest. Late in 1525, he crossed the Indus with an army that was small compared with the forces his principal enemy could potentially assemble. That numerical weakness has helped make the coming battle famous. But counting soldiers alone obscures what Babur had spent decades learning. He had survived Central Asian warfare. He understood mobile cavalry. His forces could employ composite bows with deadly effectiveness. And critically, Babur had adopted gunpowder weapons, including field artillery and matchlock firearms, with Ottoman-trained specialists such as Ustad Ali Tsuli and Mustafa playing important roles. The confrontation came near Panipat on April 21st, 1526. Opposite Babur stood Ibrahim Lodi. Contemporary numbers for medieval and early modern armies are notoriously uncertain, and later retellings often inflate them. What can safely be said is that Ibrahim commanded a substantially larger army and possessed numerous war elephants. Babur responded by shaping the battlefield before the main attack began. His troops used carts linked together as part of a defensive arrangement, with openings allowing cavalry and other units to move through. Earthworks and obstacles reduced the ability of Ibrahim's larger force to exploit its numerical advantage. Artillery and firearms added noise, smoke, destructive force, and psychological shock. Babur also relied on mobile cavalry formations capable of attacking from the wings. Ibrahim's army advanced into an increasingly compressed and lethal space. Then the Mughal flanks closed against it. The battle ended with Ibrahim Lodi dead. For the first time in Babur's turbulent life, the road before him led not back toward a lost Central Asian city, but toward Delhi and Agra. Panipat is conventionally treated as the foundation of the Mughal Empire. But on the morning after the battle, there was no guarantee that an empire would survive. Babur had defeated one ruler. He had not subdued northern India. Many Afghan chiefs remained powerful, and to the southwest stood an opponent who would test Babur far more seriously than a simple narrative of inevitable Mughal conquest suggests. That opponent was Rana Sanga of Mewar. Rana Sanga had built a formidable Rajput coalition and emerged as one of the strongest political figures in northern and western India. The relationship between Babur and Rana Sanga before Panipat remains debated in some details, including claims about previous understandings between them. What is certain is that after Ibrahim Lodi's defeat, their interests collided. Babur intended to remain. Rana Sanga had no reason to accept the permanent establishment of a new imperial power in the Indo-Gangetic Plain. The confrontation frightened Babur's men. India's heat, unfamiliar environment, and distance from their Central Asian homes had already damaged morale. Some wanted to take the wealth acquired from Delhi and Agra and return to Kabul. Babur refused. He had spent too much of his life winning kingdoms only to lose them. He renounced wine in a public gesture and tried to transform the struggle into a cause capable of binding his army together. He also increasingly used the language of Islamic holy war when describing the conflict against Rana Sanga. That rhetoric was real, even though Babur's larger political world cannot be explained by religion alone. Again, Babur used field fortifications, gunpowder weapons, and coordinated cavalry. The fighting was fierce. Rana Sanga was wounded and removed from the battlefield. His coalition was defeated. Calma mattered because it demonstrated that Panipat had not been an isolated accident. Babur had defeated the Delhi Sultan. Now he had survived a major Rajput challenge. In 1528, he took Chundari from the Rajput ruler Medini Rai. In 1529, at Gagra, he confronted Afghan forces in the east. By then, Babur had created something much more substantial than a raiding domain. Yet he had almost no time to turn conquest into stable government. He died in Agra in December 1530 at the age of 47. His remains were eventually transferred to Kabul, where his tomb lies in the garden setting he preferred. And it is through Babur's own writing that we know him with an intimacy unusual for a 16th century conqueror. The Baburnama, written primarily in Chagatai Turkic, does not merely record campaigns. Babur describes landscapes, fruits, animals, cities, gardens, relatives, victories, humiliations, friendships, and his own emotions. He could assess a battlefield and then complain that India lacked the grapes and melons he loved. He recorded beauty with the same attention he gave political danger. He was violent because the political world in which he operated was violent, but he was not reducible to violence. He was a conqueror who remembered what it was to be homeless. That may explain why the kingdom he established in India mattered so much to him. He had finally found a realm large enough to replace the one he had lost. Whether his descendants could keep it was another question entirely. Babur's eldest son Humayun inherited the throne at the end of 1530. He was 22. What he inherited looked impressive on a map. In reality, Mughal control rested on recent victories, uncertain allegiances, and a ruling elite whose loyalty could not be assumed. Humayun also faced a dynastic problem common to Timurid political culture. Princes did not necessarily regard themselves as obedient subjects of an eldest brother. They possessed claims of their own. Humayun's brothers, especially Kamran Mirza, became recurring complications. Kamran established substantial authority in Kabul and Punjab. Rather than providing Humayun with a secure Western reserve, the arrangement created a rival Timurid center whose cooperation could never be guaranteed. Meanwhile, major enemies emerged elsewhere. To the west, Bahadur Shah of Gujarat built an increasingly powerful state. To the east, an Afghan leader named Farid Khan was quietly becoming far more dangerous. History remembers Farid Khan by the title Sher Khan and eventually as Sher Shah Suri. Humayun initially concentrated significant effort against Gujarat. He achieved striking successes in 1535, capturing territories for Bahadur Shah. But conquest moved faster than administration. Mughal gains proved difficult to retain. While Humayun's attention shifted between threats, Sher Khan strengthened himself in Bihar and Bengal. This contest would determine whether Babur's dynasty survived. Humayun moved east and occupied the Bengal capital of Gaur. But the campaign exposed his communications and allowed Sher Khan to maneuver strategically. By 1539, Humayun found himself in a dangerous position near Chausa. On June 26th, Sher Khan's forces attacked. The Mughal army suffered a disastrous defeat. Humayun escaped across the Ganges with great difficulty. The famous story that a water carrier helped save him became part of later historical memory, though details have acquired legendary embellishment. Sher Khan emerged from Chausa with greater confidence and adopted the royal title Sher Shah. Humayun still possessed an army and remained emperor. One more defeat would change that. It came at Kannauj, also known as Bilgram, in May 1540. Humayun's forces failed again. Delhi and Agra were lost. Less than 14 years after Babur's victory at Panipat, the dynasty he founded had been driven from its Indian throne. For the next 15 years, there was no Mughal emperor ruling Delhi. And the ruler who replaced Humayun deserves more than the role of temporary interruption. Sher Shah Suri constructed a powerful Afghan-led state. His reign as sultan lasted only from 1540 to 1545, but he became famous for administrative and fiscal measures that later Mughal government would build upon. His administration worked to improve revenue assessment. He issued a high-quality silver currency, the rupiah, an important stage in the monetary history that ultimately gave the modern rupee its name. Roads and communications received significant attention. The route commonly associated with the later name Grand Trunk Road connected important parts of northern India, although the history of these routes long predated Sher Shah, and later rulers continued to develop them. Caravanserais and postal arrangements helped movement across the state. Sher Shah's government demonstrated a fundamental truth that the Mughals would eventually absorb. Winning India required armies. Governing it required information, roads, money, officials, and predictable methods of extracting revenue. Sher Shah did not have long to develop his system. In 1545, while besieging the fortress of Kalinjar, he was fatally injured in a gunpowder explosion. His son Islam Shah maintained Sur authority for several more years. After Islam Shah's death in 1554, however, rival claimants fractured the dynasty. Humayun had spent the intervening years surviving one of the most remarkable reversals in Mughal history. Driven from northern India, he moved through Sindh and sought support wherever he could find it. During these wandering years at a market in Sindh, his wife Hamida Banu Begum gave birth in 1542 to a son. The boy was named Jalal al-Din Muhammad. History would know him as Akbar. At that moment, however, there was no reason to imagine the infant would become one of the most powerful rulers in the world. His father barely possessed a kingdom. Eventually, Humayun turned west towards Safavid Iran. Shah Tahmasp, I received the exiled Mughal ruler. Persian assistance became essential to Humayun's restoration. The relationship also brought Humayun's dynasty into even deeper contact with Safavid court culture. Sources describe pressure on Humayun to conform publicly to Sharia practices at the Safavid court, but reducing the episode to a simple, clearly documented permanent conversion is misleading. What mattered politically was that Tahmasp supplied support. With that assistance, Humayun recovered Kandahar in 1545 and then re-established himself in Kabul. His struggle with Kamran continued for years. Eventually, Kamran was captured, blinded, and sent toward Mecca, removing the most persistent dynastic rival. Then events in India presented Humayun with the opening he had waited for. The Sur state had fractured. In 1555, Mughal forces advanced into Punjab. The capable commander Bairam Khan played a critical role. After victory against Sur forces at Sirhind, Humayun entered Delhi once again. 15 years after losing his father's empire, he had recovered it. Then, after barely half a year securely restored in Delhi, he died. In January 1556, Humayun fell on the steps of the Shir Mundal building in Delhi's Purana Kila. Traditional accounts connect the accident with his response to the call to prayer, though the precise circumstances are difficult to establish with certainty. His injuries were fatal. The emperor who had lost a kingdom, crossed deserts, sought aid from Persia, defeated his brothers, and recovered Delhi survived his restoration for only months. But the exile that seemed to define Humayun's failure had changed the Mughal dynasty. Persian artists, administrators, literary habits, and aesthetics entered Mughal life with renewed force. That Persianate influence would become one of the defining features of the imperial court. Humayun's tomb in Delhi, commissioned by his widow Haji Begum, also known as Bega Begum, became one of the great monuments of early Mughal architecture. Its combination of monumental mausoleum and formal garden anticipated architectural ideas later brought to extraordinary refinement under Shah Jahan. Humayun left something else behind, a 13-year-old son, and almost immediately, that boy faced the possibility of losing everything again. Akbar was in Punjab when news of Humayun's death reached the Mughal leadership. Bairam Khan became the young emperor's guardian and regent. The coronation took place at Kallanur in February 1556. But Delhi itself was about to fall. The man threatening Mughal power was Hemu, or Hem Chandra, an exceptionally capable Hindu commander and administrator serving the Sur claimant Adil Shah. Hemu had risen through a political world often more flexible than later religious narratives suggest. By 1556, he had won a sequence of campaigns. He defeated Mughal forces near Delhi, occupied the city, and assumed royal authority, adopting the title Vikramaditya. For Akbar and Bairam Khan, retreat toward Kabul was one possible response. They chose to fight. The two armies met at Panipat on November 5, 1556. The location carried obvious historical weight. 30 years earlier, Babur had defeated Ibrahim Lodi there. Now Babur's grandson was fighting for the survival of the restored dynasty. Haymu's army included a substantial force of war elephants, and he personally commanded from an elephant at the center of the battle. The fighting initially placed the Mughals under severe pressure. Then Haymu was struck in the eye by an arrow. He collapsed unconscious. His disappearance from active command had a devastating effect on his army. Mughal forces took control of the battlefield. Haymu was captured and subsequently killed. Accounts differ over Akbar's personal role in his death. Some traditions portray the young emperor as striking him. Others indicate Bairam Khan carried out or completed the execution. The uncertainty matters because later writers had reasons to shape the scene according to the image of Akbar they wished to present. What is certain is that Haymu's defeat secured an extraordinary reprieve for the Mughals. Akbar now possessed Delhi. Possessing Delhi, however, was not the same as possessing India. For the first years of his reign, Bairam Khan exercised enormous authority. He had served Humayun loyally and was indispensable during the crisis of 1556. But regencies contain their own danger. The child grows older. The guardian does not automatically grow less powerful. By 1560, Akbar was ready to rule personally. Bairam Khan was dismissed and instructed to undertake the pilgrimage to Mecca. He rebelled briefly, surrendered, and was forgiven. Akbar allowed him to proceed. Before Bairam could leave India, however, he was assassinated in Gujarat by an Afghan with a personal grievance. The regent who had helped preserve the dynasty was gone. The emperor was about 17, and now one of the most consequential reigns in South Asian history truly began. Akbar's genius did not lie in discovering that conquest was necessary. Every Mughal emperor understood that. His achievement was recognizing that conquest alone could never be enough. The empire's rulers were a minority governing a population of extraordinary religious, linguistic, social, and political diversity. A court composed only of a narrow Central Asian military elite would remain vulnerable forever. Akbar therefore expanded not only Mughal territory, but the range of people who could become invested in Mughal success. His relationship with the Rajput states became central to that transformation. This did not mean every Rajput ruler submitted peacefully, nor did it mean Mughal-Rajput relations were consistently harmonious. Akbar used diplomacy, marriage alliances, appointments, and war. The Kachwa House of Amber became especially closely associated with the Mughal court. In 1562, Akbar married a daughter of Raja Barmal of Amber, usually identified in contemporary Persian sources through her lineage rather than by the later popular name Judha Bai. Her family entered imperial service. Her son would eventually become Emperor Jahangir. Rajput nobles, such as Raja Bhagwant Das and Rajaman Singh rose to extraordinary rank within Mughal service. They were not decorative representatives of conquered peoples. They commanded armies and governed provinces. The arrangement gave Akbar powerful regional allies, while giving Rajput houses access to imperial resources and prestige. But where negotiation failed, the emperor could be ruthless. In 1567, Akbar besieged Chittor, the great fortress of Muir. It fell in 1568 after a hard siege. Contemporary Mughal accounts describe a large-scale killing after the conquest. This episode complicates any portrayal of Akbar as simply a modern apostle of tolerance. His later reputation for broad political inclusion was real and important. So was his capacity for brutal warfare. Empires frequently contained both. Muir itself did not disappear. Under Maharana Pratap, resistance continued. In 1576, Mughal forces commanded principally by Rajaman Singh confronted Pratap at Haldigati. The Mughals held the battlefield, but Pratap escaped. The result did not eliminate resistance. Over subsequent years, Maharana Pratap recovered substantial parts of his territory, although Chittor itself remained beyond his control. The conflict therefore resists a simplistic description as either complete Mughal conquest or decisive Rajput victory. It was a struggle in which battlefield success did not automatically create total political submission. Elsewhere, Akbar's empire expanded dramatically. Malwa was conquered beginning in 1561. Gujarat was conquered in 1572 and 1573, giving the empire access to some of the richest commercial networks connected to the Arabian Sea. Bengal was brought under Mughal authority through a longer and more difficult process. Kashmir was annexed in the 1580s. Sindh followed. Mughal expansion eventually pushed into the Deccan. By Akbar's final years, the empire was one of the dominant states of Eurasia. But Akbar's armies were only half of what made his reign transformative. The other half was the machinery behind them. The empire required a way to turn conquered land into reliable revenue and military service. One major institution became known as the Mansabdari system. Mansab meant rank. Imperial officers received rank positions that helped determine status, salary, and military obligations. Under the developed system, distinctions such as Zat and Sawar related to personal rank and the cavalryman and officer was expected to maintain. These nobles were frequently compensated through assignments of revenue from lands known as jagirs rather than owning those territories outright as hereditary private estates. The emperor could transfer assignments. That gave the center leverage over its elite. In principle, the noble depended on imperial service rather than possessing an untouchable territorial base. In practice, the system was complicated and constantly negotiated, but it provided Mughal government with a flexible structure capable of incorporating men from radically different backgrounds. Turani, or Central Asian, nobles served beside Irani immigrants. Indian Muslims served beside Rajputs. Over time, Deccanis and Marathas would also enter the imperial system. Akbar was creating an elite whose political identity increasingly depended upon proximity to the Mughal throne. Revenue administration underwent equally important development. Raja Todar Mal, one of the most famous officials associated with Akbar's fiscal reforms, helped develop systems for measuring land, classifying cultivation, establishing revenue rates, and organizing collection. The ZAB system was especially significant in core regions where conditions permitted systematic measurement and assessment. The docile arrangements commonly associated with Todar Mal used multi-year averages of prices and production to calculate assessments. But the Mughal revenue system was never perfectly uniform across the entire empire. Different regions required different arrangements, nor should its purpose be romanticized as simply creating fair taxes. The Mughal state wanted enormous revenue from agriculture. peasants could face heavy burdens. Local zamindars remained significant intermediaries and political actors. The state's achievement was not eliminating exploitation. It was constructing a comparatively sophisticated mechanism for estimating, assigning, and collecting a share of agricultural surplus across a vast territory. That revenue paid soldiers. Soldiers expanded the empire. Expansion produced more revenue assignments. And that cycle, while functioning, gave the Mughal state extraordinary power. Akbar also altered the political relationship between the imperial government and religion. In 1563, he abolished the pilgrimage tax at certain Hindu sacred sites. In 1564, he abolished the jizya imposed on non-Muslims. These actions had obvious symbolic importance in an empire whose population was overwhelmingly non-Muslim. But his intellectual development went further. Akbar was personally illiterate in the conventional sense, though evidence suggests he had extraordinary memory and cultivated books through being read to. He developed an intense interest in theological and philosophical questions. At Fatehpur Sikri, the imperial city he built near the residence of the Chishti Sufi Saint Sheikh Salim Chishti, Akbar established the Ibadat Khana, or House of Worship, in 1575. At first, discussions there involved Muslim scholars. The debates became contentious. Akbar grew frustrated with doctrinal quarrels. Hindu thinkers participated. So did Jains. Zoroastrians appeared at court. Jesuit missionaries traveled from Portuguese Goa and discussed Christianity with the emperor. Akbar listened, questioned, argued, observed. This did not mean that he assembled world religions and invented a modern secular creed. The reality was stranger and more specific to Mughal kingship. Akbar increasingly emphasized Sulh Kul, usually translated as universal peace, as a principle of governance transcending sectarian divisions. He also enhanced the emperor's own spiritual and political authority. A document produced in 1579, sometimes called the Mazar, gave Akbar significant authority to choose among competing interpretations of Islamic law under specified circumstances. It did not simply proclaim him supreme religious ruler over all questions, but it reflected the changing balance between emperor and religious scholars. Later, a small circle of devoted courtiers participated in what was known as the Din-i-Ilahi, or more accurately in some interpretations, the Tawhid-i-Ilahi. Calling it a new religion can be misleading. It had no mass following, no scripture comparable to established religions, and no serious program to convert the empire's population. It was closer to an ethical and devotional discipleship centered on Akbar and his vision of sovereignty. Meanwhile, Akbar sponsored translations that crossed cultural boundaries. The Sanskrit Mahabharata was translated into Persian as the Razmnama. Other Sanskrit works, including versions of the Ramayana, entered Persian literary circulation. These projects did not erase religious difference, but they exposed Persian-speaking court elites to Indian intellectual traditions on an unprecedented imperial scale. The visual arts experienced a similar fusion. Humayun had brought Persian painters such as Mir Sayyid Ali and Abd al-Samad into Mughal service. Akbar expanded the imperial workshop dramatically. Persian techniques interacted with Indian artistic traditions. Large illustrated manuscripts required teams of artists. Painters developed increasingly dynamic scenes filled with crowds, landscapes, architecture, animals, and individualized faces. The Hamzanama became one of the great early projects. The illustrated Akbarnama later turned the emperor's own reign into visual history. And behind much of what historians know about Akbar stands one extraordinary writer. Abu el-Fazl ibn Mubarak became the emperor's close companion and ideological interpreter. His Akbarnama chronicled Akbar's reign. Its third volume, the Ain-i-Akbari, described aspects of imperial administration, economy, court organization, military structures, geography, and society with remarkable ambition. Abu el-Fazl wrote to glorify his sovereign, so his work cannot be treated as neutral observation. But without it, our knowledge of Akbar's state would be vastly poorer. Not everyone admired the direction of court. Abd al-Qadir Badayuni, another contemporary historian, viewed many of Akbar's religious experiments with hostility. Read together. These voices reveal something invaluable. Akbar's court was not a place of effortless harmony. It was a place of argument, and the emperor deliberately stood at the center of that argument. Architecture gave physical form to the same mixture of traditions. Fateh Sikri became Akbar's most famous imperial project. Its palaces, audience halls, courtyards, mosque, and monumental gateways employed red sandstone and drew on architectural traditions with roots across India, Iran, and Central Asia. The Buland Darwaza remains among its most imposing structures. The city is sometimes said to have been abruptly abandoned because it simply ran out of water. That explanation is too neat. Water supply may have been a challenge, but changes in imperial strategy, especially Akbar's movement toward the northwest, also affected the city's political role. Mughal capitals were not always fixed in the modern sense. The court moved with the emperor. Power followed the imperial camp. Akbar eventually governed from Lahore for years while concentrating on the northwest. Later he returned toward Agra. That mobility was itself part of Mughal kingship. Yet for all Akbar's control over nobles, provinces, and armies, one problem remained beyond administrative reform: his own family. Prince Salim, Akbar's eldest surviving son, grew impatient. Succession in the Mughal dynasty had no rule of automatic primogeniture guaranteeing that the eldest son would peacefully inherit. Every prince knew that a throne might have to be won. Salim established an increasingly independent court at Allahabad around the turn of the 17th century. The conflict became personal and dangerous. In 1602, Abu el-Fazl was killed by the Bundala chief Bursing Deo in an ambush arranged at Salim's instigation. Akbar lost one of his closest companions. His own son had helped engineer it. Yet Salim remained the most viable successor. When Akbar died in October 1605, after approximately 49 years on the throne, the Mughal Empire was unrecognizable from the precarious kingdom he had inherited. He was buried at Sikandra near Agra. Prince Salim became emperor. He took the title Nur al-Din Muhammad Jahangir. The name Jahangir meant Caesar of the world. But the new emperor's first challenge came from his own son. In 1606, Prince Khusro rebelled. The revolt failed. Khusro was captured and punished. During the crisis, the fifth Sikh guru, Guru Arjan, was arrested and executed. Jahangir's own memoir associates Guru Arjan with Khusro and also reveals the emperor's hostility toward his growing religious following. The precise combination of political, financial, and religious motives behind the execution has been debated. Its consequences were profound. The Sikh community's relationship with Mughal authority grew increasingly strained. Under Guru Hargobind, the sixth guru, Sikh leadership adopted a more explicitly martial dimension. The conflict between Sikh power and the Mughal state would develop across generations. Jahangir himself differed sharply from Akbar while preserving much of the system his father created. He did not dismantle Mansabdari government. He continued to employ Hindu nobles. Rajput commanders retained major roles. Persian remained central to imperial culture. But Jahangir's personal interests gave his reign a different texture. He had an extraordinary fascination with painting and natural observation. Mughal artists under his patronage developed portraiture and studies of animals, birds, and plants to astonishing levels of precision. The painter Ustad Mansur became famous for his natural history images. Jahangir recorded unusual animals in his memoirs and took pride in distinguishing the hands of different artists. Painting became a form of imperial knowledge. An emperor could order the world around him represented, classified, and preserved on paper. Jahangir also cultivated an image of justice. One famous tradition describes a chain of justice installed where petitioners could supposedly attract the emperor's attention directly. The symbolism mattered even if the practical reality of imperial justice was far more complex. Jahangir wished to be seen as a ruler who could stand above faction and correct abuses. Yet his own court increasingly revolved around a woman who became one of the most powerful figures ever to inhabit the Mughal palace. Her name before marriage was Mir-un-Nisa. Jahangir married her in 1611. She became known first as Nur Mahal and then Nur Jahan, Light of the World. Nur Jahan was not merely an emperor's favorite wife. Her father, Mirza Ghiz Beg, rose to enormous prominence under the title Itamad ud Dawla. Her brother Asaf Khan became another central political figure. Her niece Arjamand Banu Begum married Prince Khurram, the future Shah Jahan. A family network now stood close to the throne. Nur Jahan herself exercised unusual public authority. Coins are struck bearing her name alongside Jahangir's. Imperial orders associated with her survive. She participated in patronage and politics. She was an accomplished hunter according to court accounts. And as Jahangir's health weakened, her role became even more consequential. But the popular image of an incapacitated emperor entirely controlled by a scheming empress oversimplifies the politics. Jahangir continued to make decisions. Nur Jahan's influence also changed over time and faced powerful rivals. The most consequential was Prince Khurram. Khurram had emerged as a highly successful imperial prince. He led important campaigns, including operations connected with Muir and the Deccan. In 1617, after success in the Deccan, he received the title Shah Jahan, King of the World. He appeared increasingly likely to inherit the empire. Then court alliances shifted. The Kandahar crisis helped push tensions toward rebellion. Kandahar occupied a strategic position between the Mughal and Safavid worlds. It had passed between competing powers before and would do so again. In 1622, Shah Abbas I of Persia captured Kandahar from the Mughals. Jahangir wanted Prince Khurram involved in the response. Khurram, worried about his own political position, resisted imperial orders and rebelled. For several years, Mughal politics were fractured by conflict between father and son. Khurram eventually submitted, but another crisis followed. In 1626, the powerful General Mahabat Khan, fearing the influence of Nur Jahan's faction and action against himself, seized Jahangir while the imperial party was near the Jhelum River. The episode was extraordinary. The emperor of the Mughal Empire was effectively taken into the custody of one of his own generals. Nur Jahan responded with political and personal boldness. Accounts describe her attempts to cross the river and rally forces. Ultimately, she maneuvered to restore the imperial couple's freedom and neutralize Mahomet Khan's coup. The episode demonstrated both her abilities and the dangerous factionalism surrounding an emperor in declining health. European merchants were also becoming more visible at the Mughal court. The Portuguese had already established an important maritime presence in the Indian Ocean. The English East India Company, chartered in 1600, wanted access to Mughal markets. William Hawkins appeared at Jahangir's court early in the reign. Later, Sir Thomas Roe arrived as ambassador from King James I in 1615, not 1619. Roe remained until 1619. His objective was to secure favorable conditions for English trade. He encountered a court whose wealth and ceremony dwarfed anything the East India Company could deploy in India at the time. This point is essential. The English did not enter Jahangir's court as future masters whose victory was somehow obvious. They were petitioners. Their maritime capabilities mattered. Their commercial ambitions mattered. But to the Mughal emperor, they were one foreign group among several seeking opportunity within a vastly richer political world. No one watching Roe negotiate in Jahangir's court could have reasonably known that, generations later, the company he represented would become powerful enough to dictate terms to Jahangir's descendants. History did not yet look that way. Jahangir died in 1627 while traveling from Kashmir toward Lahore. His tomb would be built near Lahore at Shadara. His death triggered another succession struggle. Nur Jahan supported the claim of Shahryar, Jahangir's son and her son-in-law. But Asaf Khan, Nur Jahan's own brother and Prince Khurram's father-in-law, supported Khurram. The contest ended quickly. Shahryar was defeated. Other potential claimants were eliminated. In 1628, Prince Khurram became Emperor Shah Jahan. The man whose reign would produce the Taj Mahal began by ensuring there were very few rivals left alive to challenge him. This juxtaposition captures something fundamental about Mughal grandeur. The dynasty that created some of the world's most beautiful buildings could also practice merciless succession politics. The two realities were not opposites. They belonged to the same imperial system. Under Shah Jahan, Mughal court ceremonial reached extraordinary refinement. The emperor presented sovereignty through architecture, clothing, jewels, audience rituals, and carefully ordered space. The peacock throne, commissioned during his reign, became perhaps the supreme object of Mughal royal magnificence. Covered in precious materials and associated symbolically with cosmic kingship, it communicated a simple message to anyone entering the imperial presence. This was not merely a wealthy ruler. This was the center of an ordered world. Shah Jahan's architecture expressed the same idea. Red sandstone remained important, but white marble became increasingly prominent in elite imperial projects. Balance and symmetry reached new levels. Floral inlay, carved marble screens, calligraphy, gardens, domes, and carefully controlled perspective transformed buildings into political statements. Then, in 1631, personal loss created the monument that would overshadow Shah Jahan's other accomplishments. His wife Arjamand Banu Begum, better known by her title Mumtaz Mahal, died at Burhanpur after giving birth to their 14th child. She had accompanied Shah Jahan during military travel and had been his close companion for years. Her death deeply affected him. Construction of her mausoleum began at Agra. The central tomb complex was substantially complete by the 1640s, while work on surrounding elements continued into the following decade. The project employed architects, calligraphers, stonecutters, inlay specialists, masons, garden designers, and laborers drawn from different regions. The Taj Mahal cannot credibly be assigned to a single mysterious architect or explained by romantic legends about workers having their hands cut off. There is no reliable evidence for that famous mutilation story. What survives is more impressive than the myth. It was a coordinated imperial project drawing on established Timurid, Persianate, and Indian architectural traditions and pushing them toward extraordinary refinement. The mausoleum rises on a platform beside the Yamuna. Its white marble changes visually with weather and light. Quranic calligraphy frames entrances. Pietra dura inlay creates flowers from colored stones. A formal garden orders the approach. The mosque and matching jawab structure balance the complex. The cenotaphs visitors see inside are symbolic. The actual graves lie in a lower chamber. When Shah Jahan eventually died, his own burial beside Mumtaz introduced an asymmetry into a complex otherwise obsessed with balance. But during the 1630s and 1640s, the Taj Mahal was only one part of Shah Jahan's imperial landscape. He created a new capital at Shahjahanabad in Delhi. Its red fort became the ceremonial heart of Mughal sovereignty. The Jama Masjid rose nearby. The city developed around markets, mansions, neighborhoods, mosques, gardens, and the great commercial avenue associated with Chandni Chowk. By the middle of the 17th century, the Mughal Empire appeared secure enough to build as though its rule would last forever. Yet armies were moving constantly beyond the marble halls. The Deccan remained a major strategic concern. Ahmadnagar was finally absorbed during Shah Jahan's reign. Bijapur and Golconda were forced into agreements recognizing Mughal superiority while retaining their dynasties for the time being. In the northwest, however, Shah Jahan pursued a dream inherited from Babur. Central Asia. For a Timurid, the ancestral homelands retained enormous emotional and dynastic significance. In the 1640s, Mughal armies occupied Balkh and Badakhshan for a time. The campaign proved extremely difficult and expensive. Supply lines stretched across formidable terrain. Uzbek resistance remained strong. The Mughals withdrew. The dynasty that had once been expelled from Central Asia discovered that possessing the wealth of India did not make reconquering its ancestral world easy. Kandahar produced another humiliation. The city had returned to Mughal control in 1638 when its Safavid governor defected. In 1649, Shah Abbas II retook it for Persia. The Mughals launched repeated attempts to recover the fortress. Princes Aurangzeb and Darashurko were involved in campaigns connected to the effort. None succeeded. By 1653, Shah Jahan had effectively lost Kandahar. The empire remained immensely powerful, but its military reach was not unlimited. At the same time, Shah Jahan's reign witnessed both prosperity and severe suffering. The empire participated in extensive internal and international trade. Indian cotton textiles were in enormous demand. Merchants connected Mughal ports and cities with Southeast Asia, Iran, Central Asia, the Red Sea, and Europe. Silver flowed into India through global commerce. Urban centers flourished. Yet imperial magnificence existed beside vulnerability. The devastating famine of 1630 to 1632 affected Gujarat, the Deccan, and surrounding regions, killing vast numbers through starvation and disease. No account of Mughal prosperity is complete without remembering the peasants and laborers whose production financed imperial armies, courts, buildings, and elites. The Mughal system was sophisticated. It was not gentle by default. Religiously, Shah Jahan represented a shift from Akbar's era without simply restoring some imagined wall between Muslims and Hindus. He presented himself as a more conventionally Islamic sovereign. Some temples were destroyed under his rule, particularly in political contexts, and there were restrictions that distinguished his policy from Akbar's broad experimentation. Yet Hindu nobles continued to occupy major positions. Rajputs remained deeply integrated into imperial service. Mughal governance still depended on a diverse elite. The transformation under Shah Jahan was therefore one of emphasis, not a sudden conversion of a plural imperial state into an exclusively Muslim administration. And within Shah Jahan's own family, dramatically different religious and political personalities were emerging. The emperor had 4 sons who would survive to fight for his throne. Dar Shirko was the eldest. Shah Shuja governed Bengal. Aurangzeb accumulated extensive military and administrative experience, including service in the Deccan and Gujarat. Murad Bakhsh governed Gujarat when the final struggle approached. Dar was clearly favored by Shah Jahan. He remained close to the imperial center and enjoyed high status. He was also intellectually adventurous. Deeply influenced by Sufism, particularly the Qadiri order, Dar became interested in Hindu religious thought. He sponsored a Persian translation of the Upanishads, known as the Sur-i Akbar, or Great Secret. He wrote the Majma ul-Bahrain, the confluence of the 2 seas, exploring parallels between Sufi and Hindu metaphysical ideas. To admirers, Dara represented intellectual openness. To critics, especially some Orthodox Muslims, his ideas approached or crossed the boundary of unacceptable religious innovation. But ideology alone did not decide what came next. The decisive trigger was an old Mughal problem. The emperor became sick. In September 1657, Shah Jahan fell seriously ill. Rumors of his death spread. Because the Mughal dynasty had no fixed law of primogeniture, every adult prince understood the danger. A brother who became emperor could imprison, blind, or kill the others. Waiting politely could mean dying. Shah Shuja declared himself emperor in Bengal. Murad Bakhsh made his own claim in Gujarat. Aurangzeb moved with greater calculation. Dara, remaining near Shah Jahan, commanded the resources of the imperial center. The struggle that followed was not an aberration in Mughal succession. It was the logical result of a dynasty in which princes were trained to govern provinces and command armies, but lacked an accepted mechanism for transferring supreme power peacefully. Blood would determine legitimacy after the fact. The opening clashes spread across northern India. In April 1658, an imperial army sent against Aurangzeb and Murad was defeated at Durmat. The road toward Agra opened. Dara now had to confront his brothers personally. On May 29, 1658, the decisive Battle of Samagar was fought near Agra. Dara possessed a large force, but numbers alone did not determine Mughal battles. Aurangzeb was a highly experienced commander. His army held. Dara's position deteriorated. At a crucial point, he descended from his elephant, and the sight of the empty imperial elephant apparently contributed to confusion among his forces. His army collapsed. Dara fled. Shah Jahan, recovering from his illness, still lived inside Agra Fort. Aurangzeb took control. The old emperor would never rule freely again. He was confined in Agra Fort under comfortable but unmistakable detention, attended by his daughter Jahanara Begum for much of his remaining life. The popular story that he spent every day staring romantically through a window at the Taj Mahal cannot be documented in the sentimental form often repeated. But he was indeed confined in the fort across the river from the mausoleum he had built. Aurangzeb still had brothers to eliminate. His alliance with Murad had never been likely to survive victory. Murad was arrested in 1658. He was eventually tried in connection with an earlier murder and executed in 1661. Shah Shuja continued fighting in the east. Defeated, he eventually fled toward Arakan in present-day Myanmar. His final fate remains uncertain, although he probably died there amid violent circumstances. Dara remained the most symbolically dangerous rival. He fled across northern and western India, trying to rebuild support. For a time, he seemed capable of continuing the contest. Then his position disintegrated. He was betrayed and captured. In 1659, Dara was brought to Delhi and publicly humiliated. He was subsequently executed after accusations of apostasy and treason were used to justify his elimination. His severed head was reportedly sent to Shah Jahan. The brutality was political theater. Aurangzeb wanted there to be no doubt. The succession war was over. There would be one emperor. Aurangzeb took the regnal title Alamgir, Caesar of the world, and the Mughal Empire entered the longest and perhaps most fiercely debated reign in its history. Aurangzeb ruled from 1658 until 1707, nearly half a century. Any attempt to compress those decades into a single word, tolerant or intolerant, successful or disastrous, fanatic or pragmatist, produces distortion. He was an orthodox Sunni ruler who took religious commitment seriously. He was also the head of a heterogeneous imperial machine whose practical requirements could conflict with those commitments. He patronized Islamic scholarship. He also employed large numbers of Hindu officials. He ordered the destruction or appropriation of some temples. He also issued grants or protections connected to other Hindu religious institutions in particular circumstances. He reimposed jizya. He fought Muslim sultanates. He spent decades battling Hindu-led Maratha forces that themselves included Muslims and negotiating with political actors whose alliances repeatedly crossed religious boundaries. The important question is not whether religion mattered. It clearly did. The question is how religion interacted with imperial politics. One of Aurangzeb's best-known acts came in 1679, when he restored the jizya on Akbar had abolished it more than a century earlier. Its reintroduction was financially useful, but also unmistakably ideological. It affirmed Aurangzeb's conception of himself as an Islamic sovereign and provoked resentment. Policies toward temples were similarly consequential. The idea that Aurangzeb ordered every Hindu temple in India destroyed is false. Such a policy would also have been practically impossible. But minimizing the destruction that did occur would be equally misleading. Major temples were destroyed or transformed under imperial orders, including the Keshava Temple at Mathura and the Vishwanath Temple at Banaras. Political rebellion, assertions of sovereignty, and religious ideology could overlap in these decisions. Their symbolic effect reached far beyond the buildings themselves. Aurangzeb also commissioned a major compilation of Hanafi Islamic law, commonly known as the Fatwa-i-Alamgiri. His courtly style was more austere than Shah Jahan's. Certain forms of imperial musical patronage were curtailed, although the often repeated claim that Aurangzeb simply banned music throughout the empire is exaggerated. Music continued beyond the formal court, and musicians found other patrons. The famous story of court musicians staging a funeral for music and Aurangzeb telling them to bury it deeply is a moral anecdote rather than reliable evidence for a total prohibition. Likewise, later traditions emphasizing that Aurangzeb financed himself solely by sewing caps or copying Qurans should not be read as literal descriptions of how an emperor supported his life. They reflect a genuine reputation for personal austerity compared with predecessors. But an emperor governing one of the world's richest states still lived inside an enormous imperial establishment. Aurangzeb was austere. The Mughal Empire was not. During the early part of his reign, his attention moved across several fronts. There were conflicts in Assam. There were disturbances among Jats and Sitnamis. There were difficult wars along the northwestern frontier. Relations with Rajput houses became increasingly complicated. And in the western Deccan, one man was building a political challenge whose consequences would outlive Aurangzeb himself. Shivaji Bhosle. Shivaji was born into a Maratha family whose members had served the Deccan sultanates. Beginning from a regional base in the hill country of western India, he captured forts and constructed an increasingly independent state. His strength came partly from geography. The Western Ghats offered rugged forts became nodes of power. Fast cavalry could raid territories and withdraw before slower imperial forces responded. But Shivaji's success cannot be reduced to guerrilla warfare. He built administration. He negotiated. He made and broke alliances. He fought Bijapur as well as the Mughals. He used diplomacy where useful and violence were necessary. In 1659, forces of Bijapur sent the general Afzal Khan against him. At a famous personal meeting, the encounter turned violent and Afzal Khan was killed. Shivaji's reputation surged. By the early 1660s, Mughal interests were directly threatened. In 1663, Shivaji launched a daring attack in Pune on the Mughal commander Shaista Khan, Aurangzeb's maternal uncle. Shaista Khan survived, but was wounded, reportedly losing fingers, and his son was killed. The humiliation was severe. The next year, Shivaji raided Surat, one of the Mughal Empire's great commercial ports, carrying away substantial wealth. Aurangzeb responded by sending Raja Jai Singh of Amber, one of the empire's most capable commanders. Jai Singh conducted a highly effective campaign. In 1665, Shivaji agreed to the Treaty of Purandar. He surrendered control of a number of forts and accepted arrangements involving Mughal service. Then came the famous journey to Agra. In 1666, Shivaji appeared at Aurangzeb's court. The meeting went badly. Shivaji believed he had been treated with insufficient honor. Aurangzeb regarded his conduct as unacceptable. Shivaji was placed under guarded residence. He escaped. The details have become legendary. Stories describe Shivaji concealing himself in baskets, supposedly carrying sweets or gifts. The precise method of escape is uncertain. What matters is that he got away from Mughal custody and returned to the Deccan. Aurangzeb had failed to neutralize him. By 1670, Shivaji renewed offensive operations and recovered numerous forts. In 1674, he underwent a formal coronation at Raigad as Chhatrapati. This was not merely theatrical. Coronation asserted sovereignty. Shivaji was announcing that he was not simply a rebellious zamindar or troublesome local chief operating inside someone else's political order. He was a king. He died in 1680. For Aurangzeb, that should have simplified the Deccan. Instead, the struggle was about to consume the final decades of his life. Another confrontation had been unfolding in Punjab. After Guru Arjan's execution under Jahangir, Sikh relations with Mughal power had experienced periods of conflict and accommodation. The ninth Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur, was executed at Delhi in 1675 on Aurangzeb's orders. Sikh tradition remembers his death especially as martyrdom for defending the religious freedom of Kashmiri Pandits facing persecution. Persian Mughal sources frame the episode differently, and historians continue to debate aspects of its immediate political context. What is beyond dispute is that the execution became a defining event in Sikh historical memory. Guru Tegh Bahadur's son, Guru Gobind Singh, would later transform the Sikh community in ways that made it an increasingly formidable political and military force. In 1699, Guru Gobind Singh founded the Khalsa. But before that moment came, Aurangzeb was drawn ever more deeply south. The Deccan sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda had survived for generations beside Mughal power. Both were Muslim-ruled states. Both had complex administrations employing Muslims and Hindus. Both had at times supported or negotiated with Maratha powers. For Aurangzeb, their continued independence obstructed complete Mughal domination of the south. In 1681, the emperor himself moved into the Deccan. He would never return to northern India. This decision transformed the remainder of his reign. Aurangzeb was already in his 60s. Instead of spending old age in Delhi or Agra, he would spend roughly a quarter century moving through military camps and besieging forts. The immediate political situation was extraordinarily complicated. Shivaji's son Sambhaji had inherited leadership after a succession struggle. Aurangzeb's own rebellious son, Prince Akbar, sought Maratha support before eventually escaping to Persia. Bijapur and Golconda remained independent. No single decisive battle could solve all these problems. Aurangzeb chose systématique conquest. Bijapur fell in 1686 after a major siege. The Adil Shahi dynasty ended. Golconda followed in 1687. Its Kup Shahi ruler, Abul Hassan, was deposed. The Mughal Empire now controlled the territories of two wealthy Deccan sultanates, including regions connected to the famous diamond trade. On a map, Aurangzeb's achievement was staggering. The Mughal realm was larger than it had ever been. But maps hide costs. Every newly conquered district required soldiers. Every fort required a garrison. Every noble expected a revenue assignment. Every army required food, animals, equipment, money, and roads. And the Maratha problem had not disappeared. It was getting worse. In 1689, Mughal forces captured Sambhaji and his companion Kavi Kailash near Sangamshwar. They were brought before Aurangzeb's camp and brutally executed. Later narratives offer elaborate descriptions of demands for conversion and horrific tortures. Some details vary across sources and should be treated cautiously. There is no doubt, however, that Sambhaji's execution was deliberately severe. Aurangzeb had killed the Maratha king, but he had not killed the Maratha state. Sambhaji's half-brother Rajaram escaped to the formidable fortress of Jinji in southeastern India. Mughal forces besieged Jinji for years. Rajaram eventually escaped before the fortress fell. When Rajaram died in 1700, his widow Tarabai assumed a leading role in resistance on behalf of her young son. Under Tarabai and other Maratha commanders, resistance became extraordinarily difficult for the Mughals to suppress. Maratha forces did not need to defeat the entire imperial army in one great confrontation. They needed to survive. They could raid revenue districts, attack supply lines, avoid unfavorable battles, recover forts after Mughal armies moved away, force the emperor to spend months or years capturing positions that might be lost again. Aurangzeb could win siege after siege and still find himself no closer to permanent peace. This was the paradox at the heart of his final years. The Mughal emperor kept conquering, and the empire kept weakening. The problem extended into the financial structure of the state. The Mansabdari-Jagirdari system depended on matching imperial officers with revenue-producing assignments. As the number of officers and military demands grew, competition for productive Jagirs intensified. Newly conquered Deccan territories did not always produce the revenue expected on paper, especially while warfare disrupted agriculture and collection. Officials might squeeze local cultivators to recover assigned sums. Zamindars could resist. Accounts could be manipulated. Assignments could change before an officer had established control. Historians have debated how severe and universal this so-called Jagirdari crisis was, but there is little doubt that the relationship between military expansion and fiscal resources became increasingly strained. Aurangzeb's religious and political decisions also damaged relationships that earlier emperors had carefully cultivated. Rajput relations provide one important example. For generations, leading Rajput houses have been pillars of Mughal military power. The crisis in Mervar after the death of Maharaja Jaswant Singh in 1678 became particularly serious. Jaswant Singh died without an adult male heir present, though his widows subsequently gave birth to sons, one of whom, Ajit Singh, survived. Aurangzeb attempted to exercise greater control over the succession in Mervar. Rathore resistance formed around the infant Ajit Singh, with Durgadas Rathore becoming a celebrated leader. Muir also became involved. War followed. The conflict did not mean every Rajput abandoned Mughal service. That never happened. But it damaged one of the political relationships that had contributed enormously to imperial cohesion since Akbar. The restoration of jizya in 1679 occurred against this same atmosphere of tightening imperial and religious policy. To explain the empire's future troubles solely through Aurangzeb's religion would be too simple. To pretend those policies had no effect would be equally mistaken. Political systems survive partly by persuading powerful groups that participation is preferable to resistance. Aurangzeb's state remained capable of attracting Hindu nobles and regional elites. Yet in several important arenas, the cost of cooperation was rising at the same time the rewards of rebellion were becoming more visible. In Punjab, Guru Gobind Singh founded the Khalsa in 1699, creating a disciplined community of initiated Sikhs carrying a distinctive identity and a martial commitment. Conflict involving Sikh forces, Mughal officials, and hill rulers intensified. Aurangzeb and Guru Gobind Singh never met in person. Near the end of the emperor's life, Guru Gobind Singh composed the Zafarnama, a famous Persian letter accusing Aurangzeb's side of violating sworn promises and challenging the moral legitimacy of such conduct. The emperor was now confronting resistance that was not simply military. His opponents were constructing their own languages of justice, sovereignty, faith, and honor. And still Aurangzeb remained in the Deccan, year after year, campaign after campaign, fort after fort. He was an old man commanding an empire that depended more heavily than ever upon his personal attention. This was itself dangerous. A highly centralized monarchy can appear strongest when an exceptionally hard-working ruler sits at its center. But the more decisions depend upon one person, the more frightening the question becomes. What happens when that person dies? By the opening years of the 18th century, Aurangzeb was well into his 80s. Many of the companions of his youth were dead. His sons watched one another. Nobles calculated their futures. Maratha armies continued operating despite decades of Mughal campaigning. The emperor had outlived enemies, brothers, sisters, rivals, generals, and entire dynasties. He had imprisoned his father. He had defeated Dara. He had destroyed the independent sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda. His armies had carried Mughal authority farther south than those of any previous emperor. On paper, he had achieved what generations before him could not. The empire extended across most of the subcontinent, and yet his surviving correspondence conveys fatigue and spiritual anxiety. Several letters attributed to his final period describe uncertainty about his life's accomplishments and the approach of death. One famous line, preserved in varying translations, has him reflecting that he came into the world alone and was departing as a stranger. The authenticity and wording of individual late letters require normal caution, but their overall image aligns with an emperor who knew that conquest had not produced the order he sought. He could feel the limits of victory. His armies had taken territory. They had not produced obedience everywhere. He could remove a sultan. He could not prevent another Maratha commander from appearing. He could appoint a governor. He could not guarantee that the governor's interests would remain identical to the throne's. He could impose a tax. He could not control every local reaction to it. He could capture a fort. He could not make geography disappear. And somewhere behind the southern armies lay Delhi, Agra, Lahore, Bengal, Awadh, Gujarat, and the immense northern territories from which the empire drew much of its wealth. The emperor had been absent from the north for more than 20 years. The machine continued to function, but it no longer functioned with the same confidence. Aurangzeb died on March 3rd, 1707, near Ahmednagar. He was 88 years old. He had ruled for almost 49 years. In accordance with his preference for simplicity, he was buried at Kuldabad, near the shrine of the Sufi Saint Sheikh Zainuddin Shirazi. His grave was strikingly modest compared with Humayun's enormous garden tomb, or the marble perfection surrounding Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal. There was no Taj Mahal for Aurangzeb. No gigantique impérial mausoleum annoncing permanent dominion. Only the grave of a ruler who had spent nearly half a century trying to discipline and expand an empire that seemed, at his death, more powerful than ever. And this is where the Mughal story becomes deceptive. Because if a traveler in 1707 had been shown a map of India and asked whether Aurangzeb had failed, the question might have sounded absurd. The empire was enormous. Its dynasty still controlled Delhi. Its administrative language and political conventions dominated much of the subcontinent. Its nobles possessed immense wealth. Its emperor's name commanded prestige from Afghanistan's approaches to the deep Deccan. European companies remained coastal powers operating within an overwhelmingly Indian political world. The British East India Company controlled trading settlements. It did not control India. The Marathas were dangerous, but their future supremacy across broad parts of the subcontinent was not yet predetermined. The Sikh community had become militarized, but the Sikh empire of Ranjit Singh belonged to a future no one could yet see. Bengal remained a Mughal province. Hyderabad had not yet become an effectively independent state. Nader Shah had not crossed the Indus. The Peacock throne still stood in Mughal possession. Delhi had not yet suffered the catastrophe of 1739. Plassey was 50 years away. The uprising of 1857 was a century and a half away. Nothing about the empire's end was inevitable in 1707. But Aurangzeb's death removed the one man who had held together the increasingly complicated structure through relentless personal authority. His sons had armies. They had ambitions. They had learned the same lesson that every Mughal prince since Humayun knew. There was no safe second place in an imperial succession. Before Aurangzeb's body had been long in the ground, his sons began moving. Prince Muhammad Azam declared his claim. Prince Muazzam prepared his own. Kam Baksh would eventually make a bid in the south. Once again, the dynasty's greatest weakness appeared at the exact moment when unity was most necessary. The empire had survived Babur's early death. It had survived Humayun's exile. It had survived the Sur interruption. It had survived Akbar's minority. It had survived rebellions by princes. It had survived Shah Jahan's succession war. It had survived nearly 50 years of Aurangzeb's relentless campaigns. Now it faced something more dangerous than any single invading army. It faced an age in which the emperor would gradually cease to be the only center around which Indian power could organize. Provincial governors would discover that Delhi needed them more than they needed Delhi. Maratha armies would move north. Sikh resistance would survive attempts to crush it. Regional courts would inherit Mughal institutions while ignoring Mughal commands. Persian and Afghan invaders would discover how vulnerable the imperial heartland had become. And merchants from a distant island kingdom, men who still needed permission to trade on Indian shores, would begin acquiring something much more valuable than spices, textiles, or silver. Aurangzeb had left his descendants the largest Mughal empire that had ever existed. He had also left them the question none of his victories had answered. Who could actually hold it together now that he was gone? Aurangzeb was dead. But the Mughal Empire did not collapse with him. There was no single morning in 1707 when officials stopped collecting taxes, governors tore down imperial standards, soldiers abandoned their posts, or subjects suddenly ceased recognizing Mughal authority. Empires rarely disappear so neatly. The machinery Aurangzeb inherited and expanded was still enormous. Imperial officers governed provinces stretching across much of the subcontinent. Mughal coinage circulated through markets. Persian remained the language of high administration across much of northern India. The Mansabdari system still connected thousands of nobles and officers to imperial rank. The emperor's name still possessed extraordinary legitimacy. Delhi remained an imperial capital recognized far beyond the territory its court could directly supervise. And yet something fundamental had changed. For almost half a century, Aurangzeb had imposed his personal authority upon a state under increasing military and financial strain. Now the man was gone. The strain remained. and the first test arrived immediately. Aurangzeb's surviving sons did what Mughal princes had repeatedly done when a throne became vacant. They prepared for war. There was still no binding law of primogeniture requiring all brothers to accept the eldest. Mughal princes had been trained as commanders and governors. They possessed households, supporters, money, soldiers, and ambitions. A prince who patiently waited for another brother to become emperor risked imprisonment or death. Aurangzeb himself had demonstrated that truth during the struggle against Nader Shah, Shah Shuja, and Murad Bakhsh. Now his sons followed the same logic. The strongest contenders were Prince Muazzam, Prince Muhammad Azam, and their younger brother Kam Bakhsh. Muhammad Azam had been close to Aurangzeb when the old emperor died in the Deccan. He moved quickly and proclaimed himself ruler. Muazzam, older and politically experienced, advanced from the northwest. Their armies converged near Jajau, south of Agra, in June 1707. The battle decided which son would inherit Aurangzeb's throne. It could not decide whether that throne still possessed the strength it had once commanded. Muazzam won. Azam and his son Baidarbakhet were killed. The victor became Emperor Bahadur Shah. He was already in his 60s. The new emperor then had to deal with Kam Bakhsh, who attempted to establish himself independently in the Deccan. In 1709, Bahadur Shah's forces defeated him near Hyderabad. Kam Bakhsh was wounded and died shortly afterward. Bahadur Shah had survived the dynastic struggle, but survival had consumed time, troops, and political attention the empire badly needed elsewhere. He inherited problems that no battlefield victory against a brother could solve. The Rajput conflict remained unsettled. The Marathas remained divided internally but dangerous. And in Punjab, Sikh resistance entered a dramatic new phase. Bahadur Shah's religious policy was generally less confrontational than Aurangzeb's, although calling him simply tolerant or conciliatory obscures the pressures he faced. He tried to negotiate with some Rajput rulers. He initially maintained relations with Guru Gobind Singh, but events moved rapidly. Guru Gobind Singh died in 1708 after being attacked at Nanded. Before his death, Sikh tradition holds that he entrusted a mission to a man who became known as Banda Singh Bahadur. Under Banda Singh, Sikh resistance became a major armed uprising in Punjab. In 1709 and 1710, Banda's forces achieved remarkable victories. They took Samama. They attacked Sirhind, whose governor Wazir Khan was associated in Sikh memory with the deaths of Guru Gobind Singh's younger sons. At the Battle of Chapar Chiri in 1710, Wazir Khan was defeated and killed. Sirhind fell. For the Mughal state, this was not a distant disturbance. One of northern India's most strategically important regions was experiencing a rebellion rooted in religious community, political grievance, and social mobilization. Some accounts emphasize Banda Singh's redistribution of land and attacks on established landed elites. The details and extent of those measures vary by region, but Sikh power unquestionably challenged existing structures of authority. Bahadur Shah personally moved north to confront the crisis. Imperial pressure forced Banda Singh from several positions, but the rebellion survived. That pattern should already sound familiar. Aurangzeb's armies had repeatedly captured Maratha forts without extinguishing Maratha power. Now Mughal forces could retake towns in Punjab without eliminating the network capable of producing resistance. The empire remained militarily formidable. Its enemies were learning how to survive military defeat. Then Bahadur Shah died in February 1712. He had ruled less than 5 years. Again, there was no settled succession. Again, sons fought. Again, nobles selected sides. Again, imperial resources were spent determining who would sit on a throne whose underlying authority was weakening every time the process repeated. Bahadur Shah's son Jahangir Shah emerged victorious from the struggle with crucial support from the noble Zulfikar Khan. That dependence mattered. The Mughal emperor had traditionally been the source from which noble authority flowed. Increasingly, emperors were reaching the throne because powerful nobles put them there. The direction of dependence was beginning to reverse. Jahangir Shah's reign lasted less than a year. His nephew Farrukh Siyar challenged him with support from two extraordinarily influential brothers, Syed Abdullah Khan and Syed Hussein Ali Khan. The Syed brothers came from Barha and possessed strong military and political networks. Farrukh Siyar's forces defeated Jahangir Shah in 1713. The defeated emperor was captured and killed. Farrukh Siyar now sat on the Mughal throne, but he owed that throne to the Sayyids. That debt became the central problem of his reign. Abdullah Khan became Wazir. Hussein Ali Khan became Mir Bakshi and later exercised enormous power in the Deccan. Together, the brothers dominated imperial politics so thoroughly that later histories remembered them as kingmakers. Farrukh Siyar wanted independence from them. They wanted an emperor who remembered who had made him emperor. Court politics became a contest of plots, appointments, removals, alliances, and counter-alliances. This was not merely palace gossip. Every great noble commanded followers. Every appointment affected access to jaggers and revenue. Every shift in faction could alter provincial government. As the imperial court fought itself, powerful men farther from Delhi had even more reason to construct independent bases. Yet one event from Farrukh Siyar's reign would acquire significance for reasons no one at court could fully anticipate. In 1717, the emperor issued a farman granting important commercial privileges to the English East India Company, especially in Bengal. The company's servants later treated this decree as an important legal foundation for expanding their trade privileges. At the time, however, the English were still one commercial organization operating within a much larger Indian political economy. They maintained armed settlements and possessed growing maritime strength, but they were nowhere near being masters of the subcontinent. Their rise would depend as much on the fragmentation of Indian politics as on anything inherent in European power. For now, Farrukh Siyar remained preoccupied with the Syed brothers. In 1719, they finally moved against him. He was deposed. He was blinded. And he was killed. The emperor of the Mughal Empire had become disposable. The Sayyids then placed young princes on the throne. Rafi-ud Darajat became emperor and died after only a few months. His brother Rafi-ud Dawla, who took the regnal title Shah Jahan II, followed and also died within months. In September 1719, another prince was elevated. He became Muhammad Shah. He would reign for almost 30 years. At first, the Syed brothers expected to control him as well. Instead, a coalition of opponents turned against them. Hussein Ali Khan was assassinated in 1720. Abdullah Khan was defeated and imprisoned. The age of the Syed kingmakers was over. But destroying the kingmakers did not restore the political world of Akbar. Too much had changed. One of the men who understood this best was Chin Kilij Khan, better known by his title Nizam ul Mulk and later Asaf Jahi. He was an experienced Mughal noble who had served across the empire. He understood Delhi's factional politics because he had participated in them, and he increasingly concluded that real power could be built more securely in the provinces. In 1724, after defeating a rival at Shikar Kheda, he established effective autonomy in the Deccan. He did not formally announce that the Mughal Empire was irrelevant. That would have been unnecessary and politically clumsy. He continued to recognize the emperor's nominal supremacy. Mughal titles survived. Imperial forms survived. But the state he founded at Hyderabad increasingly made its own decisions. This became one of the defining features of 18th century India. The empire was not simply being replaced by rebels. It was being transformed by its own servants. Governors, military commanders, revenue officials, and nobles used Mughal institutions to construct regional states. They often continued minting coins in the emperor's name. They sought imperial titles. They respected Mughal ceremonial conventions. They borrowed the language of Mughal legitimacy. Then they ignored Delhi whenever its instructions conflicted with their interests. Bengal followed a comparable path. Murshid Suli Khan, originally a Mughal revenue administrator, developed powerful control over Bengal's fiscal machinery. He shifted the provincial center toward the city that became Murshidabad. Revenue was reorganized. Local elites were disciplined or incorporated. Tribute might still be remitted toward Delhi, but Bengal was becoming increasingly autonomous. Its agricultural wealth and textile production made it one of the richest regions in the world economy. European merchants desperately wanted Bengal's goods. The Dutch traded there. The French traded there. The English traded there. Armenian and Indian merchant networks remained crucial. Bengal's wealth did not exist because Europeans arrived. Europeans arrived in such numbers because Bengal was wealthy. Awadh also emerged as a major regional power. In 1722, Sadiq Khan Buran-ul-Mulk became governor. He and his successors built a durable political order in the Gangetic Plain while retaining the formal language of Mughal allegiance. Again, this was not a clean declaration of independence. It was something subtler. The imperial center became less capable of enforcing authority. The provincial state became more capable of exercising it. Power moved without the symbols necessarily moving with it. And while these successor states grew, another force was expanding from Western India. The Marathas. Aurangzeb had spent the last decades of his life attempting to destroy Maratha resistance. Instead, the Long War had helped militarize a political system capable of expanding far beyond Shivaji's original kingdom. After Aurangzeb's death, Maratha politics included a struggle between competing branches. Shahu, a grandson of Shivaji who had spent years in Mughal captivity, was released during the post-Aurangzeb political maneuvering. He competed with Tarabai's faction for leadership. Shahu eventually established himself at Satara. Under him, the office of Peshwa became increasingly important. And one Peshwa in particular changed the balance of power across India. Baji Rao became Peshwa in 1720. He was young. He was aggressive. And he understood that the declining Mughal system presented opportunities far beyond Maharashtra. Maratha forces pushed into Malwa. They operated in Gujarat. They demanded chauth and other fiscal rights from territories that had once supplied revenue to the Mughal treasury. Fast cavalry allowed them to move with a speed that repeatedly embarrassed slower imperial forces. Baji Rao did not need to conquer every city permanently. He needed to demonstrate that regional rulers and Mughal officials could not ignore Maratha power. In 1737, Maratha cavalry made a spectacular dash toward Delhi. Baji Rao appeared near the imperial capital before Mughal defenses could respond effectively. He did not occupy the city permanently. He did something politically more unsettling. He demonstrated that he could reach it. The psychological distance between the Mughal emperor and his enemies had collapsed. Delhi, once the heart of an empire, could now be threatened by forces moving through territories the emperor theoretically ruled. The following year, Mughal and allied forces suffered another major setback at Bhopal. Maratha influence in central India was confirmed. Muhammad Shah remained emperor. His court continued to produce art, music, poetry, and refined culture. The emperor's later nickname, Rangila, meaning colorful or pleasure-loving, has encouraged caricatures of him as a frivolous ruler whose personal indulgence destroyed the empire. That explanation is inadequate. Muhammad Shah certainly presided over a court associated with artistic revival and pleasure. But the structural problems he inherited were far larger than an emperor's personality. Regional fiscal autonomy, factional nobility, Maratha expansion, weak frontier defenses, a military system whose command structure was increasingly fragmented. Those forces would have challenged even a more energetic ruler. Then, from beyond the northwestern frontier, came a man who exposed every weakness at once. His name was Nader Beg. History knows him as Nader Shah. He rose from relatively obscure origins in northeastern Iran amid the collapse of Safavid power. Afghan Hotak forces had invaded Iran and occupied Isfahan. Ottoman and Russian forces had taken advantage of Safavid weakness. In 1736, he crowned himself Shah of Iran. His armies were experienced, mobile, disciplined, and hardened by years of warfare. After securing Iran and campaigning in Afghanistan, Nader turned toward Mughal territory. There were disputes concerning Afghan fugitives and frontier security, but the enormous wealth associated with India offered an irresistible incentive. The northwestern Mughal defenses were weak. Kabul fell. The invaders crossed the Indus. Lahore was taken. Only then did the Mughal court assemble its principal army. The confrontation took place at Karnal in February 1739. The Mughal force was large. It also suffered from divided command and poor coordination. Nader's army was smaller but tactically cohesive and highly experienced. Mughal nobles acted without adequate coordination. Sadiq Khan of Awadh advanced and became heavily engaged. Other contingents failed to rescue the situation effectively. Within hours, Mughal resistance collapsed. Muhammad Shah met Nader. The road to Delhi was open. Imagine what that meant. Almost exactly 2 centuries earlier, Babur had entered Delhi after defeating Ibrahim Lodi. Akbar had transformed the throne into the center of an enormous political system. Shah Jahan had rebuilt imperial Delhi as a city designed to embody universal monarchy. Now another conqueror was approaching that city. Nader Shah entered Delhi in March 1739. Initially, an uneasy order prevailed. Then rumors spread that Nader had been killed. Delhi residents attacked Persian soldiers. The retaliation was catastrophic. On March 22nd, Nader Shah ordered a massacre. Persian troops killed inhabitants and looted neighborhoods. The exact number of dead cannot be established with confidence. Contemporary and later estimates vary greatly. often reaching tens of thousands. What matters is the scale of trauma. A city that represented Mughal sovereignty was subjected to organized killing while the Mughal emperor remained powerless to stop it. Muhammad Shah reportedly appealed to Nader to end the slaughter. Eventually, the order was given, but Delhi's suffering was not finished. Nader systematically extracted wealth from the imperial court, nobles, merchants, and inhabitants. Gold, silver, jewels, cash, luxury objects. Among the treasures taken was Shah Jahan's famous peacock throne. The Koh-i-Noor diamond also passed into Nader's possession, though the histories of famous gems are frequently surrounded by later legend. The amount of wealth carried from India was staggering. It helped Nader reduce or suspend taxation in Iran for a period. For Delhi, the financial and psychological consequences were devastating. This was not simply a raid that removed treasure. It destroyed an assumption. For generations, even when Mughal authority weakened in distant provinces, Delhi remained a symbolic center. Now the center itself had been conquered and plundered. The emperor had survived. The dynasty still existed. But everyone watching understood that survival and power were no longer the same thing. Nader withdrew. He did not annex the Mughal heartland. He took territories west of the Indus into his sphere and carried the plunder back toward Iran. Muhammad Shah remained on the throne. There is something almost cruel about that fact. The emperor was not removed. He was left behind to preside over the evidence of his own weakness. Then Nader Shah was assassinated in 1747. His empire fragmented. One of his former commanders, Ahmad Khan Abdali, established a new Afghan state and became known as Ahmad Shah Durrani. India's northwest had not escaped danger. It had merely changed invaders. Ahmad Shah Durrani invaded northern India repeatedly between 1748 and the 1760s. Punjab became a battleground. Delhi was threatened and occupied. Regional powers competed to control the space the Mughals could no longer defend. Meanwhile, Sikh groups in Punjab endured terrible persecution, yet continued developing into armed confederacies known as missals. Maratha forces pushed farther north. The Mughal emperor became increasingly dependent on whichever regional power could protect Delhi at a particular moment. Muhammad Shah died in 1748. His successors struggled inside a political environment where imperial sovereignty was rapidly becoming negotiable. Ahmad Shah Bahadur succeeded him. Court factions dominated his reign. In 1754, he was deposed and blinded. Alamgir II was placed on the throne. He possessed a grand imperial title deliberately echoing Aurangzeb. He did not possess Aurangzeb's power. The real contest for northern India increasingly involved the Afghan Durranis, the Marathas, regional Mughal-derived states, Sikh forces, and powerful nobles such as Imad ul-Mulk. Alamgir II was assassinated in 1759. His son, Prince Ali Guher, had already fled Delhi. He would become Shah Alam too. But before following him, the story must move east. Because while armies fought over Delhi and Punjab, a commercial corporation was learning how to turn Indian political divisions into revenue. Bengal had become effectively autonomous from Delhi. Under Alivardi Khan, who seized a Nawabship in 1740, Bengal remained prosperous despite repeated Maratha incursions known in Bengal's memory as the Bargi raids. Alivardi spent years defending his province. When he died in 1756, his grandson Siraj-ud-Daulah succeeded him. Siraj inherited wealth. He also inherited enemies. Members of Bengal's elite disliked him. Powerful bankers, officials, commanders, and relatives had their own interests. The East India Company had established a fortified commercial base at Calcutta. Company servants engaged in lucrative private trade and made aggressive use of trading privileges. Siraj objected to the unauthorized strengthening of Calcutta's fortifications amid Anglo-French tensions and to aspects of company behavior within his territory. In June 1756, his forces captured Calcutta. Then came one of the most famous and controversial stories in the history of British India. According to an account later publicized by company servant John Zephaniah Holwell, British prisoners were confined overnight in a small guardroom at Fort William, and many died from heat, suffocation, and overcrowding. The event became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. That prisoners suffered and some died is generally accepted. The exact numbers reported by Holwell and parts of his narrative have long been disputed. Later British imperial culture magnified the episode into a powerful justification for retaliation. It is an example of how historical events can become political weapons through the way they are remembered. The British returned under forces including Robert Clive and Admiral Charles Watson. Calcutta was retaken, but Clive did not simply prepare for an open military confrontation with Siraj. He negotiated secretly with disaffected members of the Nawab's own political world. Among them was Mir Jafar, one of Siraj's commanders. The conspiracy also involved powerful commercial interests. The East India Company promised political rewards. Its partners promised betrayal. On June 23, 1757, the forces met at Plassey. The battle has acquired enormous significance because of what followed. As a military engagement, however, it was strange. Siraj's army substantially outnumbered Clive's force. But large parts of the Nawab's army, controlled by conspirators, did not seriously engage. A smaller contingent loyal to Siraj fought. Rain affected gunpowder and artillery operations. By the end of the day, Siraj's position had collapsed. He fled. He was captured and killed soon afterward. Mir Jafar became Nawab. The East India Company received enormous payments. Plassey was not the moment Britain instantly conquered India. Most of the subcontinent remained outside company control. The Marathas were immensely powerful. Mysore would become a formidable opponent. Hyderabad remained important. Awadh remained independent. The Sikh missiles were rising. But Plassey gave the company something transformative: political leverage over Bengal. And Bengal possessed extraordinary resources. The difference between a merchant and a ruler is not merely that one has soldiers. A ruler can make other people pay for the soldiers. The East India Company was approaching that threshold. Mir Jafar soon discovered that being installed by the company did not mean he could satisfy its endless financial demands. He was replaced by Mir Qasim. Mir Qasim attempted to build an independent base, reform his army, and escape company domination. Conflict followed. He allied with Shuja-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Awadh, and Shah Alam II, the wandering Mughal emperor. Their combined forces confronted the company at Buxar in October 1764. This battle was more militarily significant than Plassey. The company army won decisively. Now Robert Clive and the East India Company negotiated not merely with a Bengal Nawab, but with the Mughal emperor himself. In 1765, the settlement associated with the Treaty of Allahabad transformed company power. Shah Alam II granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. In formal terms, this right derived from Mughal sovereignty. In practical terms, an emperor who could not control those provinces was recognizing the fiscal authority of the corporation that could. The symbolism is difficult to overstate. Babur had founded the empire with an army. Akbar had strengthened it by constructing systems to collect land revenue. Now one of the richest revenue systems descended from Mughal rule was being handed to a European trading company. And the company could use Indian tax revenue to finance Indian troops commanded by British officers in wars against other Indian states. Conquest could begin funding more conquest. This was a mechanism far more powerful than anything the company's 17th century merchants had possessed. But India still did not belong to Britain. Not even close. The second half of the 18th century was a multipolar struggle. Mysore emerged as a major southern power under Hyder Ali and then his son Tipu Sultan. The Maratha Confederacy remained powerful despite a catastrophic defeat. Hyderabad maneuvered between rivals. Awadh tried to preserve its position. The Sikh missiles expanded in Punjab. The company itself suffered defeats as well as victories. There was no predetermined march from Plassey to complete British domination. The future remained open. One of the most important contests occurred far from Bengal. By the late 1750s, Maratha influence had extended astonishingly far into northern India. Maratha armies reached Punjab and temporarily displaced Afghan influence from important areas. Ahmad Shah Durrani returned. The struggle culminated on January 14, 1761, at the Third Battle of Panipat. Again, Panipat, the same northern plain where Babur had defeated Ibrahim Lodi in 1526. The same region where Akbar's forces had defeated Humayun in 1556. Now the Mughal emperor was almost irrelevant to a battle deciding the balance of power in northern India. On one side stood the Maratha army, led in the campaign by Sasharab Bao and accompanied by Vishwasrao, heir to the Peshwa. On the other stood Ahmad Shah Durrani with Afghan forces and Indian allies. The fighting was enormous and brutal. The Marathas suffered a catastrophic defeat. Senior commanders were killed. Thousands died in the battle and its aftermath. The loss devastated Maratha political leadership, but did not permanently destroy Maratha power. Within a decade, they would return to northern India. And that tells us something crucial about 18th century politics. Great battles could reorder alliances. They did not necessarily create permanent empires. Shah Alam too experienced this instability personally. After Buxar and Allahabad, he lived for years away from Delhi, dependent upon arrangements with the company. The Emperor of Hindustan resided at Allahabad under circumstances shaped by British power. He received payments. His imperial authority was invoked in legal documents. His name retained prestige, but he wanted to return to Delhi. In 1771, Maratha power made that possible. Under Mahaji Shinde, also known as Mahaji Scindia, Maratha forces restored Shah Alam II to Delhi. The emperor returned to the ancestral capital, but he returned under Maratha protection. This was the new political reality. A Mughal emperor could still confer legitimacy. He could bestow titles. His name could dignify power, but someone else increasingly had to provide the soldiers. Delhi itself reflected the centuries' violence. It had been invaded repeatedly. Its economy and population had suffered, yet its cultural life survived. This is one of the striking features of Mughal decline. Political weakness did not produce immediate cultural silence. Poetry flourished amid insecurity. Urdu literary culture developed dramatically in Delhi and other courts. The language often called Urdu emerged over a long period from Indo-Aryan vernaculars, especially forms of Hindavi or the Delhi region Kariboli, interacting with Persian, Arabic, and Turkic vocabulary and literary cultures. It was not simply invented in a Mughal palace, nor was it merely Persian mixed with Indian speech. Its history was deeper, regional, and gradual. By the 18th century, however, Delhi's literary world was giving the language extraordinary prestige. Mir Taqi Mir, one of Urdu's greatest poets, lived through Delhi's repeated disasters. His poetry carried the emotional world of a city witnessing political ruin. Empire was shrinking. Language was flowering. Then came another humiliation almost unimaginable in earlier centuries. In 1788, the Rohilla chief Ghulam Qadir seized Delhi. His hostility toward the Mughal court was intense. Searching for treasure he believed the imperial family had concealed, he subjected palace inhabitants to abuse and humiliation. Shah Alam, too, was an old man. He had almost no capacity to resist. Ghulam Qadir blinded him. The emperor who inherited the title once held by Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb could no longer see his own court. The symbolism was devastating. Contemporaries remembered the horror. Poets turned it into lament. But even this was not the end of the Mughal dynasty. Mahadji Scindia's forces retook Delhi and punished Ghulam Qadir. Shah Alam remained emperor, blind, dependent, still useful, still legitimate enough that stronger powers preferred to control him rather than abolish him. The East India Company continued expanding. Its conflicts with Mysore became increasingly intense. Hyder Ali had built a powerful army using both Indian and adapted European military methods. His son Tipu Sultan continued the struggle. Tipu attempted diplomatic connections with France and other foreign powers. He modernized aspects of his military and administration. He became one of the company's most determined enemies. 4 Anglo-Mysore wars were fought between 1767 and 1799. In the final war, British-led forces and their allies besieged Seringapatam. Tipu Sultan was killed in May 1799 defending his capital. Mysore's ability to challenge company expansion was broken. The Marathas remained. The company fought the Maratha powers in several wars. These conflicts involved diplomacy, rival Maratha houses, internal succession disputes, subsidiary alliances, and increasingly effective company armies. In 1803, during the Second Anglo-Maratha War, British forces under General Gerard Lake defeated Maratha forces near Delhi. The company entered the imperial capital. Shah Alam too passed from Maratha protection to British protection. The word protection concealed the real relationship. The British East India Company now controlled Delhi. The Mughal emperor became its pensioner. Shah Alam died in 1806. The man had lived through extraordinary reversals. He had been a fugitive prince, an emperor without Delhi, an ally of Indian rulers defeated by the company at Buxar, a grantor of Bengal's Diwani, a dependent at Allahabad, a restored monarch under Maratha protection, a victim blinded inside his own capital, and finally a pensioner under British power. His life almost perfectly traced the changing meaning of Mughal sovereignty. His son succeeded as Akbar Shah too. The name itself looked backward to greatness. The political reality looked forward to colonial rule. Akbar Shah II possessed almost no independent territorial authority beyond the palace sphere allowed to him. The company increasingly stripped Mughal ceremonial claims of their practical meaning. British residents supervised relations with the court. Imperial finance dépendait en allowance. Disputes within the royal family could become matters for company officials. Yet the Red Fort remained culturally significant. Court rituals survived. Titles mattered. Poetry mattered. Genealogy mattered. An imperial world could continue socially after it had died politically. One of Akbar Shah II's court figures illustrates this strange overlap between old legitimacy and emerging anti-colonial politics. The reformer Ram Mohan Roy was given the title Raja by Akbar Shah II and traveled to Britain in connection with the emperor's financial claims. A virtually powerless Mughal sovereign was still using inherited imperial forms to negotiate with the commercial colonial power that controlled him. Akbar Shah II died in 1837. His successor was Abu Zafar Sirajuddin Muhammad Bahadur Shah. History remembers him as Bahadur Shah II, or more commonly Bahadur Shah Zafar. He was in his early 60s when he became emperor. By any conventional political definition, there was almost no empire left for him to govern. But there was still a court, and there was still Delhi, and there was still memory. Zafar was a poet. His chosen poetic pen name, Zafar, meant victory. History would give the name a bitter irony. He wrote in Urdu and participated deeply in Delhi's literary culture. His court was associated with some of the greatest names in 19th century Urdu poetry. Sheikh Ibrahim Zak served as royal tutor and poet laureate. Mirza Ghalib inhabited the same wider literary world. The emperor himself wrote ghazals. The Red Fort was therefore no longer the strategic headquarters from which generals were sent to conquer Gujarat, Bengal, or the Deccan. It had become something simultaneously smaller and more intimate. A cultural universe. Poets competed. Verses circulated. Etiquette mattered. Old families remembered rank. Musicians and artisans preserved traditions. The emperor performed ceremonies whose political substance had mostly vanished. Outside the walls, British power continued expanding. The East India Company had changed beyond recognition. It administered Bengal. It controlled vast territories through the presidencies of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. It maintained enormous armies, most of whose rank-and-file soldiers were Indian sepoys. It had defeated Mysore. It had broken Maratha supremacy in a final series of wars ending in 1818. It increasingly intervened in princely succession and internal government. Some states were annexed. Others survived under subsidiary alliances and British residence. By the middle of the 19th century, company power covered or dominated most of the subcontinent. Even so, British rule changed India unevenly. Some groups benefited from new commercial opportunities. Others lost privileges. Some Indian elites collaborated with company administration. Others resented it. Soldiers could build careers in company armies while simultaneously feeling discrimination and anxiety about service conditions. Landholders might gain under one revenue arrangement and lose under another. Artisans faced changing markets rather than one uniform experience of collapse. Religious reform movements grew among Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and others. Missionaries expanded their activities under British protection. New educational institutions appeared. English language education grew. Railways and telegraphs began altering communication. The colonial state became more intrusive, and with that intrusion came suspicion. Many Indians feared that British policy aimed ultimately at transforming their society and religion. Some fears were based on actual missionary ambitions. Others emerged from rumor. But rumor can become politically real when people already distrust those governing them. British annexation policies intensified the atmosphere. Under Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, the doctrine of lapse was used to annex several princely states where the company refused to recognize adopted heirs for purposes of succession. Satara, Jhansi, and Nagpur were among the states annexed under such policies. Then, in 1856, the company annexed Awadh. This was especially consequential. The British justified annexation by accusing Awadh's government of misrule. But Awadh was not merely another territory. It was deeply connected to the Bengal Army's recruitment base. Many sepoys came from families with ties to the region. Landholders and court dependents were disrupted. Soldiers watched a state long allied with the company simply disappear. Meanwhile, the British were making their intentions toward the Mughal dynasty increasingly obvious. The emperor's sovereignty had already become fiction. Now even the fiction seemed destined for abolition. After the death of Zafar, British authorities did not intend to allow his successors to retain the same imperial status or indefinitely occupy the Red Fort. The dynasty was being slowly prepared for disappearance. Zafar could see it. He lacked the power to prevent it. Then a military technology dispute touched every accumulated anxiety at once. The East India Company's Bengal Army introduced the pattern 1853 Enfield rifle. To load it, soldiers had to bite open a paper cartridge before pouring the powder and ramming the projectile. Rumors spread that cartridges had been greased with cow fat and pig fat. For Hindu soldiers concerned with the sacred status of the cow, and Muslim soldiers for whom pigs were religiously prohibited, the implication was alarming. British authorities modified procedures and disputed aspects of the rumors. But by then, the technical truth about particular batches of cartridges was almost secondary. Many sepoys believed their religious practices were being deliberately threatened. The cartridge controversy became a symbol for broader distrust. Pay grievances, overseas service concerns, racial discrimination, promotion barrière, annexation, religious anxiety, changes in landholding, resentment against foreign control. Different people carried different grievances. No single cause explains what happened next. In March 1857, at Barakpur, Sepoy Mongol Pandey attacked British officers. He was arrested and executed. Tension continued. At Meerut, 85 troopers of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry who had refused cartridges were court-martialed and publicly imprisoned. Their humiliation in front of fellow soldiers intensified anger. On May 10th, 1857, Sepoys at Meerut mutinied. They freed imprisoned comrades. British officers and civilians were attacked and killed. Then the rebels made a decision that transformed a military mutiny into something much larger. They rode toward Delhi. Why Delhi? The Mughal emperor commanded no major army. He controlled no great treasury. He had no administrative network capable of coordinating rebellion across India. But he possessed something the rebels lacked: legitimacy. The British had spent decades reducing the Mughal emperor to a pensioner. Yet they had not succeeded in erasing what the dynasty meant. When the Meerut rebels entered Delhi on May 11th, they went to Bahadur Shah Zafar. The old poet suddenly found armed men demanding that he become emperor in more than ceremony. Zafar was around 81. He did not create the uprising. There is no credible evidence that he had secretly planned the Merit Mutiny. He was initially shocked and hesitant. He understood his helplessness. He knew the British military response would be formidable. He also understood that refusing thousands of armed rebels inside Delhi might not save him. The insurgents proclaimed him their sovereign. Under immense pressure, Zafar accepted a leadership role. For the first time in generations, proclamations in a Mughal emperor's name became instruments of active rebellion against British authority. Delhi erupted. Company administration collapsed inside the city. British officers and civilians were killed. Indian Christians were also targeted in some places. The violence included atrocities that would later be central to British accounts of the uprising. At the same time, British reprisals during the Reconquest would themselves become extraordinarily brutal. Neither reality should be concealed. The uprising of 1857 was not one unified national revolution in the modern sense, nor was it merely a narrow sepoy mutiny. It began with military rebellion. It spread into substantial civilian uprisings in parts of northern and central India. Dispossessed rulers joined. Landholders joined. Peasants joined in some regions. Urban groups participated. Others remained neutral. Many Indians actively fought for the British. The Punjab did not rise in the same way as the Gangetic heartland. Large parts of southern India remained comparatively quiet. The Sikh princely states and many Sikh soldiers did not rally to restore Mughal authority. The rulers of Hyderabad and numerous other princely states did not join Zafar. The rebellion therefore fractured India rather than uniting the entire subcontinent. But where it spread, it could be devastating. At Kanpur, Nana Sahib, the adopted son of the former Maratha Peshwa Baji Rao II, became a leading figure. British men, women, and children were killed in events culminating in the Bibigar massacre. British retaliation was savage. At Lucknow, rebels besieged the British residency for months. Awadh became one of the great centers of resistance. Begum Hazrat Mahal played an important political role and supported the claim of her young son Burjis Khader. At Jhansi, Rani Lakshmibai emerged as one of the rebellion's most famous leaders. Her kingdom had been annexed under the doctrine of lapse. Her exact role in the killing of Europeans at Jhansi remains disputed. What is certain is that she later became a determined military opponent of the British. She fought alongside forces associated with Takya Tope. She died in battle near Gwalior in June 1858. Her reputation would outgrow the rebellion itself. In Bareilly, Khan Bahadur Khan led resistance. In Bihar, the elderly Kunwar Singh fought company forces with remarkable persistence. Different regions produced different leaderships. There was no effective central command connecting them all, and this was one of the rebellion's greatest weaknesses. Zafar's name could provide a common symbol. It could not create a modern command structure. Inside Delhi, rebel regiments arrived from different places carrying their own officers and expectations. Discipline was inconsistent. Money and supplies became serious problems. The imperial court had neither the administrative power nor the resources required to control the insurgents. Zafar complained about disorder. He issued commands that were not always followed. Prince Mirza Mughal attempted to assume administrative and military responsibilities, but lacked the authority and experience necessary to impose unity. Then Bucket Khan arrived from Bareilly with rebel soldiers and artillery. He possessed substantial military experience and tried to organize the city's defense more effectively. But rivalries and mistrust limited coordination. The restored Mughal sovereignty existed more convincingly on proclamations than in administration. Yet those proclamations are historically important. Rebel appeals often emphasize cooperation between Hindus and Muslims. They accused British rule of threatening religion and established social order. The Mughal emperor's name offered an umbrella beneath which groups with otherwise different interests could imagine resistance. There's a profound irony here. For generations, British officials had preserved Mughal forms because they found them useful. Now rebels used Mughal legitimacy against the British. The symbol had escaped colonial control. The British understood that Delhi had to be retaken, not merely because of its strategic location. As long as Bahadur Shah Zafar remained at the head of a rebel court inside the Red Fort, the uprising possessed an imperial center. British forces established themselves on the Delhi Ridge north of the city. For months, fighting continued. The summer heat was ferocious. Disease killed men. Artillery thundered against positions around the city. Both sides suffered. British forces received reinforcements, including units from Punjab. Crucially, the company could draw upon Indian troops and allied rulers who did not support the rebellion. This alone complicates any simple picture of 1857 as Britain against India. The British state in India survived partly because large numbers of Indians fought on its side. By September, siege artillery had opened breaches in Delhi's defenses. On September 14, 1857, British forces launched their assault. Street fighting followed. The city was retaken section by section. The cost to Delhi's inhabitants was enormous. British troops, enraged by stories of killings earlier in the rebellion and brutalized by months of siege warfare, carried out widespread reprisals. Suspected rebels were executed. Civilians suffered. Neighborhoods were emptied. Property was looted. Large sections of the population were expelled. Delhi's social and cultural world was shattered. The city that had survived Nader Shah was being devastated again. Bahadur Shah Zafar fled the Red Fort. He took refuge at Humayun's tomb. Think about that location. The last Mughal emperor sought sanctuary beside the mausoleum of the emperor who had once lost India, gone into exile, returned with Persian assistance, and restored the dynasty 3 centuries earlier. Humayun had come back. For Zafar, there would be no restoration. On September 20th, Major William Hodson secured Zafar's surrender. The old emperor was taken into British custody. The next day, Hodson captured several Mughal princes, including Zafar's sons Mirza Mughal and Mirza Khizr Sultan and his grandson Mirza Abu Bakr. Near the Kuni Darwaza, Hodson shot them. Their bodies were exposed publicly. The message was unmistakable. The British were not merely retaking Delhi. They were destroying the political future of the Mughal house. Zafar was returned to the Red Fort, but this time he entered not as emperor. He entered as a prisoner. In early 1858, the British put him on trial. The proceedings took place inside the palace from which his ancestors had ruled. The charges included aiding rebellion, assuming sovereignty against the British, and involvement in the killing of Christians. Zafar's defense emphasized his lack of genuine control over the mutineers. There was truth in that claim. The rebels had forced events upon him, He had not commanded the uprising in the manner of a powerful sovereign directing an organized war. But after accepting leadership, he had sanctioned proclamations and become its central symbol. The British court found him guilty. They had already decided that the Mughal dynasty had no future in Delhi. The punishment was exile. In October 1858, Bahadur Shah Zafar and a small group of family members were removed from Delhi. They were eventually taken to Rangoon in British-controlled Burma. He would never see India again. The Mughal dynasty, which had entered India from beyond its northwestern frontier under Babur, ended with its final emperor carried eastward into exile by a foreign power that had first entered India as merchants. History rarely produces symmetry this stark, but the political consequences of 1857 extended far beyond one family's fate. The British Parliament passed the Government of India Act of 1858. The East India Company's rule ended. India came under the direct authority of the British Crown. The company that had received commercial privileges from Mughal emperors gained Bengal revenue through a Mughal grant and expanded across the subcontinent through war and diplomacy had become unnecessary. A corporation had helped conquer an empire. Now a European monarchy inherited the corporation's possessions. Queen Victoria's proclamation in November 1858 promised, among other things, greater respect for Indian religious practice and princely rights. British colonial policy changed in response to the rebellion. The army was reorganized. The proportion and deployment of European troops changed. Recruitment patterns shifted. Princely states were increasingly treated as useful allies rather than inevitable targets for annexation. Colonial officials became intensely concerned with classifying Indian communities by religion, caste, ethnicity, and what they imagined to be martial qualities. The Raj that emerged after 1857 would differ from company rule. But for the Mughals, there was no adjustment, only extinction as a ruling house. Zafar spent his final years in Rangoon under surveillance and in reduced circumstances. The poet who had inherited the title of emperor possessed no kingdom and no city. He died on November 7th, 1862. He was buried in Rangoon. His grave was initially kept deliberately inconspicuous, and the precise burial location later became uncertain before a site was identified in the 20th century and developed into the shrine associated with him today. A famous Urdu verse is often quoted as Zafar's final lament, saying that the unfortunate Zafar could not obtain even 2 yards of land for burial in the beloved's country. The verse captures his fate perfectly, but its attribution to Zafar is disputed. That uncertainty is worth preserving. History does not become less moving when legend is separated from evidence. Sometimes the documented facts are powerful enough. He had been born into the Red Fort. He had sat on the throne of Timur's descendants. He had written poetry in a city whose literary culture he loved. At 81, soldiers had forced him into the center of the greatest revolt British rule had yet faced. His sons were killed. His court was destroyed. His city was taken from him, and he died thousands of kilometers away. With him, the continuous line of Mughal emperors ended. But the story does not, because political death and historical disappearance are different things. The British could abolish the title. They could exile the emperor. They could occupy the Red Fort. They could demolish or repurpose buildings around Delhi. They could reorganize administration. They could replace Persian with English in important spheres of government. But they could not remove 3 centuries of Mughal rule from the landscape. It was already embedded too deeply. Start with the physical world. Humayun's tomb still rises in Delhi. It represents more than Humayun. Its garden setting and monumental form belong to the architectural conversation that would eventually culminate in the Taj Mahal. Fatehpur Sikri still preserves Akbar's extraordinary experiment in imperial space. Agra Fort preserves layers from multiple reigns. Lahore Fort carries Mughal transformations. The gardens of Kashmir preserve, even after centuries of alteration, the dynasty's fascination with ordered landscapes and water. The Red Fort remains in Delhi. The Jama Masjid still dominates part of the old city skyline. And beside the Yamuna at Agra stands the Taj Mahal. Its survival can make the empire appear timeless. It was not. The people who constructed these buildings lived in a world of succession wars, taxation, famine, political ambition, religious argument, love, grief, and death. The marble survived circumstances the dynasty itself could not. Mughal architecture was also never merely Persian architecture in India. Its builders drew on Timurid and Iranian traditions, certainly. The formal garden had important Persianate and Central Asian precedents. The monumental gateway, double dome, calligraphy, geometric planning, and imperial garden all belong to wider architectural worlds. But Indian materials, craftsmen, structural traditions, decorative vocabularies, and regional forms were fundamental. The result changed over generations. Akbar's red sandstone buildings do not look identical to Shah Jahan's marble monuments. Mughal architecture evolved because the empire itself evolved. That process occurred in painting as well. Early Mughal art inherited major techniques from Persian manuscript painting. Then Indian artists entered the imperial workshops in large numbers. European prints reached court and introduced unfamiliar methods of shading, perspective, and Christian imagery. Jahangir's painters developed extraordinary naturalism. Imperial albums assembled portraits, calligraphy, animals, flowers, and carefully bordered compositions. When central patronage declined, artists did not simply disappear. They moved. Regional courts in Rajasthan, Punjab, Awadh, Hyderabad, Bengal, and elsewhere developed or transformed artistic traditions partly through the movement of people once connected to Mughal centers. Decline at one court could become creativity at another. The popular story that Mughal music began with one emperor and ended when Aurangzeb supposedly buried it is nonsense. North Indian musical traditions developed across Hindu and Muslim courts, temples, Sufi institutions, hereditary musician communities, and regional patronage networks. The Mughal court was enormously influential, but never the sole source of culture. Tansun, famously associated with Akbar, became almost legendary. Later musicians continued innovating even when imperial patronage changed. Cultural traditions survived rulers because practitioners could find new audiences. Cuisine offers another example. It is tempting to point at every biryani, kebab, or rich meat dish and call a Mughal invention. Food history is rarely that simple. Many dishes associated today with Mughlai cuisine have layered histories involving Central Asian, Iranian, Indian, regional Muslim, and later colonial influences. Rice and meat dishes existed in multiple cultures. Kebabs long predated Mughal India. Different biryanis developed in different regions. What Mughal and successor courts did contribute was an influential elite culinary culture in which ingredients, techniques, and tastes circulated between regions. Saffron, nuts, dried fruits, perfumed waters, slow-cooked meat, rice preparations, rich gravies, Indian spices. Court kitchens could bring these elements together in elaborate forms. Those forms spread and changed. The food survived because people adapted it, not because one emperor invented a menu that remained frozen for centuries. Language presents an even deeper legacy. Persian served as a major language of Mughal administration and elite culture. Its influence extended far beyond Muslim communities. Hindu scribal groups learned Persian because government and employment rewarded it. Histories were written in Persian. Poetry flourished in Persian. Administrative vocabulary spread. At the same time, North Indian vernaculars continued developing. The language eventually known as Urdu acquired a major literary presence. Its poetry absorbed Persian forms, such as the ghazal, while remaining structurally an Indo-Aryan language. Delhi became one of its great centers. So did Lucknow. By Zafar's reign, Urdu poetry had reached extraordinary sophistication. Ghalib wrote in both Persian and Urdu. Zak wrote at the Mughal court. The emperor wrote poetry himself. The dynasty lost India. The language associated with its final court expanded far beyond the palace. Today, Urdu is a national language of Pakistan and a constitutionally recognized language of India, spoken and read by communities across South Asia and the diaspora. Hindi and Urdu shared deep linguistic foundations even as their standardized literary forms developed different scripts, vocabularies, and political associations. That entire history is part of the cultural world shaped during and after Mughal rule. Administration produced legacies of another kind. The Mughals did not create centralized government from nothing. They inherited institutions from earlier Delhi sultanates, regional kingdoms, Afghan rulers such as Sher Shah, and older Indian traditions. They adapted what worked. Their revenue officials measured and classified land. Their nobles were ranked. Their provinces were divided administratively. Information moved through news writers, messengers, officials, and local intermediaries. Zamindars could function as revenue collectors, landed magnates, local chiefs, or some combination depending upon region. There was never one perfectly uniform model covering the entire subcontinent. But the Mughal state helped establish administrative practices so extensive that later regional rulers and the British often worked through institutions and social relationships inherited from it. The East India Company did not enter Bengal and discover an administrative vacuum. It appropriated an existing fiscal state. British officials then altered those systems for colonial purposes, sometimes radically. The permanent settlement in Bengal in 1793, for example, transformed relationships involving zamindars and revenue by fixing assessments under a new colonial framework. That was not simply the Mughal system continued. It was a British attempt to remake Indian agrarian government using institutions and terminology they had inherited and often misunderstood. This pattern repeated across colonial rule. The conquerors became students of the people they conquered. They collected Persian manuscripts. They translated Mughal documents. They surveyed monuments. They employed Indian munshis and officials. They adopted words into English. They sometimes dressed in Indian styles during the company's earlier period. Then, as racial attitudes hardened and British sovereignty became more confident, social distance increased. Yet even the colonial state that displaced the Mughals could never fully escape Mughal political geography. Delhi remained too important symbolically. In 1911, more than half a century after Zafar's exile, the British announced that the capital of British India would move from Calcutta to Delhi. A new imperial city, New Delhi, was constructed beside the older Mughal capital. The British were building their own monumental seat of rule beside Shah Jahan's city. Empires often attempt to replace their predecessors while simultaneously borrowing their prestige. The irony did not end there. In 1947, British colonial rule in India ended. The subcontinent was partitioned into independent India and Pakistan amid enormous communal violence and mass migration. Delhi became the capital of independent India. The Red Fort, once the center of Mughal imperial ceremony and later a British military site, acquired another meaning. On August 15, 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru raised independent India's flag at the Red Fort. Successive Indian prime ministers would continue addressing the country from its ramparts on Independence Day. A Mughal fortress became a stage for post-colonial national sovereignty. History had changed the meaning of the building again. The Mughal past itself remains contested. That is unavoidable. The empire ruled an enormous and diverse region for centuries. No single community experienced it in one way. For some modern observers, Akbar represents political accommodation and pluralism. Others emphasize the violence inherent in his conquests. Aurangzeb is remembered by some as a pious and administratively serious sovereign. Others remember temple destruction, jizya, and conflicts that became part of Hindu and Sikh historical memory. Shivaji can be studied as a sophisticated early modern state builder, celebrated as a regional and national hero, or deployed in modern political narratives that impose later identities onto a 17th century world. Dara Shurko is sometimes romanticized as the tolerant alternative who would have changed everything had he won. That too requires caution. We know what Dara read and wrote. We do not know how 50 years of his hypothetical rule would have unfolded. History record choices actually made, not perfect alternate worlds. The term Mughal itself carries another irony. It derives from the Persian form of Mongol. Babur, however, primarily understood himself within a Timurid and Chagatai cultural world. He wrote in Chagatai Turkic. He was proud of descent from Timur. His maternal Chinggisid ancestry mattered, but the dynasty became progressively Indian. Akbar was born in Sindh. Jahangir was born in Fatehpur Sikri. Shah Jahan was born in Lahore. Aurangzeb was born at Dahod in Gujarat. They married into Indian families. Their administrations depended on Indian elites. Their wealth came overwhelmingly from Indian agriculture and trade. Their political struggles were Indian struggles. By the later generations, calling them simply outsiders becomes increasingly inadequate. Yet calling them purely indigenous in origin would erase the Central Asian conquest from which the dynasty began. Both realities belong to the same history. The empire arrived through conquest. Then it became rooted in the land it conquered. That pattern is not unusual in world history. It is simply difficult to fit into modern categories. Religion presents the same problem. The Mughals were Muslim emperors. Islam mattered deeply to their conception of rule. Mosques, Islamic scholarship, Sufi networks, legal institutions, and the prestige of the wider Islamic world were integral to imperial life. At the same time, most Mughal subjects were not Muslim. No durable Mughal government could function without negotiating that reality. Akbar responded through extraordinary political inclusion and religious experimentation. Jahangir maintained much of his father's plural governing structure while retaining his own prejudices and ordering Guru Arjan's death. Shah Jahan moved toward more conventional Islamic kingship while continuing to rely heavily on Hindu elites. Aurangzeb adopted more explicitly orthodox policies, restored jizya, and ordered significant temple destructions, while his administration still included many Hindu officials and his wars repeatedly crossed simple religious lines. The empire was neither a modern secular state nor a permanently uniform theocracy. It was an early modern monarchy whose religious policies changed according to rulers, circumstances, political calculations, and sincere belief. Its violence should not be hidden. Its pluralism should not be hidden either. The same principle applies to its economy. At its height, Mughal India was one of the great centers of world production. Its textiles reached markets across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Bengal's cottons and silks were especially prized. Gujarat's ports connected inland production to the Indian Ocean. Merchants moved money through sophisticated credit networks. Silver from the Americas reached India indirectly through European and Asian trade because foreign merchants wanted Indian goods. Urban centers could be enormous. Agra impressed foreign visitors. Delhi became monumental. Lahore prospered. Dhaka grew as a center of textile production. Surat became an international port, but wealth was unequally distributed. The imperial elite consumed enormous resources. Peasants produced much of the taxable surplus. Bad harvests could become disasters. War could devastate. Revenue demands could remain inflexible even when cultivators suffered. Famine exposed the limits of imperial protection. Court magnificence existed because resources moved upward through a deeply hierarchical society. The Taj Mahal and the suffering of 17th century peasants are not separate histories. They belong to the same economic world. Nor should Mughal decline be reduced to one emperor making one mistake. Aurangzeb's long Deccan wars were enormously costly. His religious policies contributed to political alienation in important contexts. The Rajput conflicts damaged alliances. The Marathas became increasingly difficult to contain. The Jagirdari system experienced mounting pressures. All of that mattered. But Aurangzeb's death did not automatically destroy a healthy machine. And his successors were not simply a sequence of uniquely incompetent men who squandered perfection. The 18th century transformed warfare and political finance. Provincial elites developed their own interests. The Mughal fiscal military system fragmented. Marathas created competing mechanisms for extracting revenue. Afghan invasions destabilized the Northwest. Nader Shah removed enormous wealth and prestige. European companies used maritime trade, access to global finance, increasingly disciplined infantry, Indian soldiers, diplomacy, and regional alliances to become territorial powers. The East India Company did not defeat the Mughal Empire once in a single decisive war. It inserted itself into a landscape already filled with Mughal successor states. It defeated Bengal forces. It fought Awadh. It confronted Mysore. It fought the Marathas repeatedly. It negotiated with Hyderabad. It eventually subdued Sikh power after the Mughal dynasty itself had nearly ceased to matter politically. British India was built from the defeat and incorporation of many Indian political systems. not simply from taking Delhi from one emperor. That distinction explains why the Mughal Empire could be effectively powerless decades before it formally ended. The dynasty experienced two deaths. The first was the death of imperial power that unfolded gradually during the 18th century. The second was the death of imperial legitimacy that happened in 1857 and 1858 when the British decided they no longer needed even the fiction of a Mughal sovereign. Yet perhaps the clearest measure of Mughal historical importance is that both enemies and successors repeatedly needed its symbols. The Marathas restored Shah Alam too because an emperor could legitimize authority. The East India Company obtained a Diwani from Shah Alam because a Mughal grant could legitimize taxation. Rebels in 1857 proclaimed Zafar because a Mughal emperor could legitimize rebellion. The British put Zafar on trial because they understood the danger of that legitimacy. An emperor with almost no territory could still matter. That is extraordinary, and it brings the story back to Babur. When Babur crossed into India in 1525, there was no Mughal Empire. There was a displaced Timurid prince with a relatively small army and a lifetime of failed attempts to recover his Central Asian inheritance. He defeated Ibrahim Lodi at Panipat. He defeated Rana Singha's coalition at Kanwa. He died 4 years after establishing himself in northern India. His son lost almost everything. For 15 years, Mughal rule disappeared from Delhi. Then Humayun returned. He died almost immediately. A 13-year-old Akbar inherited the throne. Against those beginnings, everything that followed becomes more remarkable. Akbar turned a precarious conquest into an imperial system. He brought Rajput houses into Mughal service while fighting others who resisted. He expanded across northern India and beyond. He restructured rank and revenue. He patronized translations across religious traditions. He made the emperor the center of an unusually diverse political elite. Jahangir inherited that machine and gave its culture a new refinement. Naturalistic painting flourished. Nur Jahan demonstrated how far political influence could extend inside the supposedly male world of Mughal sovereignty. European ambassadors arrived as petitioners seeking trade. Shah Jahan transformed imperial aesthetics. The Taj Mahal rose. Shahjahanabad was built. The peacock throne displayed wealth almost beyond imagination. Then his sons went to war. Aurangzeb won. He ruled longer than any other major Mughal emperor. He expanded farther. He conquered Bijapur and Golconda. He imposed a more orthodox vision of kingship. He fought Rajputs, Sikhs, Marathas, and others. He spent the final decades of his life trying to secure conquests too extensive to stabilize cheaply. When he died, the map was enormous. The political balance beneath it was not. Then the imperial center began losing what the provinces had once supplied. Bengal moved toward autonomy. Awadh moved toward autonomy. Hyderabad moved toward autonomy. The Marathas collected revenues that once flowed toward Mughal officials. The Sikhs survived persecution and eventually became a major power in Punjab. Nader Shah entered Delhi and carried away the peacock throne. Ahmad Shah Durrani repeatedly invaded northern India. Marathas and Afghans fought at Panipat while the Mughal emperor watched from political irrelevance. The East India Company gained Bengal, then Bengal's revenue, then armies financed by that revenue, then more territory. By the time company troops entered Delhi in 1803, the emperor's dependence was almost complete, and yet the dynasty remained. Until 1857, The empire's final act did not begin with an emperor commanding an army. It began with Indian soldiers refusing cartridges at merit. They rode to Delhi because history had left them one symbol strong enough to place above their rebellion. An 81-year-old poet, Bahadur Shah Zafar, could not recreate Akbar's empire. He could barely control the rebels occupying his own city. But for several months, the name Mughal again meant sovereignty rather than nostalgia. Then British artillery breached Delhi. The city fell. Princes died. The emperor was tried. The dynasty was exiled. In 331 years after Babur's victory at Panipat, Mughal rule formally ended. But stand in Delhi today, and the ending becomes difficult to believe. Humayun's tomb is still there. The Red Fort is still there. The Jama Masjid is still there. Walk through old neighborhoods, and the urban landscape preserves fragments of Shahjahanabad. Travel to Agra, and the fort still rises above the Yamuna. Across the river, the Taj Mahal remains. Go north toward Kashmir, and Mughal gardens still frame water against mountains. Travel to Lahore, and Mughal architecture remains fundamental to the old city's historical identity. Listen to Urdu poetry, and the literary inheritance of the Indo-Persian world remains audible. Read administrative vocabulary across South Asian languages, and fragments of Persianate governance survive in everyday speech. Eat dishes shaped by centuries of courtly and regional exchange, and the past appears in forms too ordinary to be recognized as historical. The empire ended. Its world did not. And perhaps that is why the Mughal story remains so difficult to simplify. It contains extraordinary beauty and extraordinary violence. It contains rulers who crossed religious boundaries and rulers who reinforced them. It contains women exercising political power within a patriarchal court. It contains princes who wrote mystical philosophy and brothers who executed them. It contains administrators calculating crop yields while armies burned contested countryside. It contains enormous wealth and devastating famine. It contains an emperor building a tomb for the woman he loved and sons fighting over his throne before he was dead. It contains a ruler who expanded the empire to its greatest geographical extent and may also have helped make that extent impossible to sustain. It contains foreign merchants who once bowed before the emperor and whose successors eventually decided whether his descendants could remain in their own palace. No single judgment can contain all of that. The Mughals were conquerors. They were also state builders. They were heirs to Central Asia. They became rulers rooted in South Asia. They patronized Persian culture. They transformed Indian culture and were transformed by it. They destroyed. They built. They taxed. They negotiated. They fought. They painted. They wrote. They planted gardens. They ordered executions. They made alliances across religion. They also fought wars in which religion mattered profoundly. Their empire was neither paradise nor an uninterrupted nightmare. It was a state created and inhabited by human beings pursuing power inside the conditions of their time. And like every empire, it once believed in its own permanence. That may be its most universal lesson. At Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar built spaces for an imperial court that eventually moved elsewhere. At Agra, Shah Jahan built a mausoleum intended to transform grief into permanence. At Delhi, the peacock throne once represented a ruler who imagined himself at the center of a universal political order. Nader Shah carried that throne away. At the Red Fort, Mughal emperors once appeared before nobles who commanded provinces across India. By Zafar's time, British officials controlled his allowance. Every generation inherited symbols of permanence from the previous one. Every generation discovered that power could move elsewhere. But art could survive power. Language could survive power. Memory could survive power. A garden could outlast the dynasty that planted it. A poem could outlast the emperor who wrote it. A building could become famous to people who knew almost nothing about the state that created it. And an empire could disappear politically while remaining embedded in the culture of hundreds of millions of people. There is one final image worth holding. Not the Taj Mahal, not Panipat, not Aurangzeb's enormous military camps, not Nader Shah entering Delhi, not Robert Clive at Plassey. Imagine instead two graves. One lies at Kabul. There in a garden rests Babur, the prince who spent his youth trying desperately to recover Samarkand, eventually found his empire somewhere else. He crossed mountains into India, won a throne, and began a dynasty whose future he could never have imagined. The other grave lies far to the east, in Yangon, the city once called Rangoon. There rests Bahadur Shah Zafar, the final emperor. Babur came from Central Asia into India because he needed a kingdom. Zafar was carried out of India because there was no kingdom left. Between those two graves lie more than 3 centuries of history. Between them stand Akbar's experiments in government, Jahangir's paintings, Nur Jahan's political ascent, Shah Jahan's marble, Aurangzeb's wars, Maratha resistance, Sikh transformation, Persian invasion, Afghan invasion, European commerce, colonial conquest, and rebellion. Between those graves lie millions of lives that never entered imperial chronicles. Farmers who produced the revenue, artisans who cut stone, women who manage households and estates, merchants who moved cloth and silver, soldiers whose names disappeared after battles, scribes who copied orders, translators who carried ideas from Sanskrit into Persian and from one intellectual world into another, musicians whose compositions survive their patrons, painters whose hands made emperors visible centuries after their bodies disappeared. The Mughal story belongs to them as much as it belongs to the men on the throne. And in the end, perhaps that is the only way to understand how an empire can die without entirely vanishing. The throne can disappear. The borders can disappear. The army can disappear. The dynasty can disappear. But once centuries of human experience have entered buildings, languages, institutions, food, music, literature, memory, and landscape, history cannot simply remove them. Babur could never return permanently to the Samarkand he dreamed of ruling. His descendants instead created something in India that became larger than his original ambition. Aurangzeb could conquer nearly the entire subcontinent and still discover that possession was not permanence. The 18th century emperors could lose almost every instrument of government while retaining enough prestige for stronger rulers to seek their approval. Bahadur Shah Zafar could lose even that and still become, in the final crisis, the name beneath which rebels imagined sovereignty. And the British could abolish the Mughal throne without abolishing the Mughal past. That past survived them too. The empire founded on the battlefield at Panipat in 1526 ended politically after the rebellion of 1857. Its final emperor died in exile in 1862. But the larger history never acquired such a clean ending. It remains in Agra when morning light reaches the marble of the Taj Mahal. It remains in Delhi when the walls of the Red Fort stand behind the flag of a country the Mughals could never have imagined. It remains in Lahore, where gardens and monuments preserve another part of the same imperial geography. It remains in archives where Persian pages record battles, salaries, harvests, marriages, animals, rebellions, and court ceremonies. It remains in paintings where emperors who have been dead for centuries still stare outward from paper. It remains in arguments about Akbar and Aurangzeb because the political choices of long-dead rulers still carry meaning in the present. It remains in the poetry of a final emperor who possessed almost nothing except words. And that is where the history of the Mughal Empire finally leaves us. Not with a simple story of rise and fall. Not with a verdict that one ruler created everything or another destroyed everything. Not with the idea that conquest inevitably produced decline, or that decline inevitably produced British victory, but with something larger. A Timurid prince lost his homeland and looked toward India. His descendants built one of the great empires of the early modern world. They learned that winning territory was easier than governing diversity. They built institutions to solve that problem. They made alliances. They fought those who would not submit. They experimented with ways of connecting imperial authority to communities radically different from their own. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they failed. Their wealth transformed cities and arts. Their struggles transformed regions. Their wars created enemies and opportunities. Eventually, the system became fragmented enough that provincial rulers inherited its power, invaders exploited its weakness, and a foreign company learned to collect its revenues. Still, the emperor remained. Then, in 1857, when rebellion swept toward Delhi, the last emperor discovered why. Power had left the Mughal throne long before. Memory had not. For one final summer, memory was enough to make the throne dangerous again. Then the cannons opened fire. Delhi fell. Zafar went into exile. The dynasty ended. The monuments remained. The languages remained. The stories remained. And more than 5 centuries after Babur first looked from Kabul toward the plains beyond the Indus, the world he helped create is still visible across South Asia. That is the story of the Mughal Empire. Not an empire that was never forgotten because it never truly disappeared from the world it had helped shape,